Hey, come on in. Pull the covers up a little higher, get comfortable and let whatever the day threw at you just stay outside the door for a while. It is not invited tonight. I am glad you found your way here, and if this happens to be your first time curling up with me, welcome. Fair warning, once you are in, there is no getting your pillow back now. Because tonight we are not staying on dry land. Tonight we are sinking straight down past the last thread of sunlight into a sea that existed hundreds of millions of years ago. And down there something is swaying in the current. Not one or two somethings. Thousands of them spreading farther than your eye could ever follow, moving together like a field of grass caught in a slow, patient wind. And here is the part that took actual scientists a surprisingly long time to accept. Not a single one of them is a plant. Before we drift any further down, let's take care of one small thing, and I promise it will only take a second. If stories like this one are the kind that help you drift off at the end of a long day, tapping that subscribe button and leaving this video a like tells me to keep the lights low and the stories coming your way. Dropping a comment helps even more than you would think, and honestly I am always curious where in the world you're tucking in from tonight and what time it happens to be where you are right now. Type it below. I really do read everyone. Now go ahead, turn the lights down until the room feels a little like the deep end of a swimming pool. Maybe let a fan hum somewhere in the background, something that sounds a little like a tide rolling in from far away. And once your shoulders start to feel heavy, let's go down together. Picture warm, shallow water somewhere close to the equator in a world that has not yet grown a single flower anywhere on land. This is the Carboniferous, a stretch of time running from roughly 359 million years ago to about 299 million years ago. And up on the surface, the story most people already sort of know is unfolding. Towering plants, some taller than a 10-story building, are crowding together into the first true forests. This planet has ever grown forests so thick and so damp that dragonflies the size of seagulls and millipedes, longer than your arm, are thriving quietly in the shade underneath them, which for the record is exactly the kind of hike I personally would have skipped. That part of the story became famous. It became coal, and coal, hundreds of millions of years later, would end up warming houses and turning the wheels of factories on the other side of time. But almost nobody ever talks about what was happening underneath the waves at that very same moment. So let's slip below the surface and see for ourselves. The light changes first, softening from a sharp white to a deep glassy blue, the way sunlight looks through the bottom of a swimming pool on a bright afternoon. The water presses gently against you as you go warmer than you would expect for something this deep, and it is quiet in a way that has nothing to do with silence. It is the quiet of somewhere that has never once heard a human voice, not a single one, not in the entire span of its existence. Shapes drift past at the edges of your vision, small and unfamiliar, the ancestors of things we do not really have names for anymore. And as your eyes adjust to the dim filtered glow, the seafloor stops looking empty. It starts looking planted. Take a moment right there. Let it be quiet for a second. Because what comes into view next is worth arriving at slowly, the way you would ease into a room you've been told your entire life does not exist. Because down there on the warm sunlit shelf of this ancient tropical sea, a different kind of forest is growing, one made entirely of animals that had, for reasons that still feel a little unfair, been shaped exactly like flowers. If you reached out a hand right now, and I would not blame you for wanting to, your fingers would meet something soft, almost velvety, folding gently closed around them the moment you touched it, the way a shy plant might curl away from a fingertip. Except this is not a reflex borrowed from any plant at all. It is closer to a flinch. It is closer to the same instinct that pulls your own hand back from something hot, just dressed up in a much gentler, much slower costume. They're called crinoids, and the easiest way to picture one is a lily balanced on a long jointed stalk, its head opening into a crown of soft feathery arms that drift wide in the current, the way petals catch a breeze. Nobody can say for certain what colours filled this garden. Soft tissue rarely survives the journey across so many millions of years, so the colour is one detail the fossils simply refuse to hand over. But their closest living relatives today come in a startling range of shades: deep purple, warm gold, blood red. So it is entirely fair to imagine this ancient meadow as something closer to a painting than a photograph swaying gently in more colours than you might expect from something that spends its whole life sitting perfectly still. Sailors and naturalists who later found their fossilised remains centuries after this scene gave them a fittingly gentle name: sea lilies. It is a lovely name, it really is, except for one small detail nobody bothered to mention. There is no lily involved anywhere. Underneath that soft floral crown sits a living, breathing animal, closer in its bloodline to a starfish or a sea urchin than to anything with roots and leaves. It eats, it reaches toward its food. In its own slow, patient way, it can even move from place to place. It simply happens to look for all the world like something you would stumble across in a garden, rather than an ocean, which, if you ask me, feels like nature playing a very long, very patient practical joke on anyone who ever tries to pick one. I know. A flower that is not a flower standing in a forest that is not a forest. At this point you would be entirely forgiven for wondering whether anything in this story is actually what it claims to be. Stay with me, because it only gets stranger from here, and honestly that is exactly why I fell in love with this particular corner of the past. Here is the detail that stopped me completely the first time I came across it. These crinoid forests were not small, and they were not rare. Across the shallow seas of the Carboniferous world they stretch for miles in every direction, growing so densely, so shoulder to shoulder, that they actually changed the way water moved along the sea floor, slowing the current the same way a real forest slows down the wind passing through it. Try to picture the largest field you've ever driven, past the kind that seems to fold into the horizon, no matter how long you keep watching out the window. Now put that field under water, replace every stalk of wheat with a living feeding animal, and let it sway there for millions upon millions of years without a single human eye ever passing over it. Whole communities of other small creatures, snails, tiny shrimp-like animals, soft-bodied drifters looking for a little shelter from the current, built their entire lives around the cover these swaying stalks provided, for a stretch of time longer than any of us can really hold in our heads. At once this was one of the most crowded, most successful neighbourhoods the ocean had ever produced. And when I say a long stretch of time, I mean it in a way that is honestly a little dizzying to sit with. If you lined up every single human being who has ever lived, stretching back through every war, every empire, every language that has come and gone, and then multiplied that entire span of human history several thousand times over, you would still fall short of how long this quiet underwater garden held its ground. Empires we consider ancient, the ones we study in school and stand in the ruins of, are barely a heartbeat by comparison. This was not a season. This was closer to a permanent feature of the planet. This single kind of garden went on to outlast the rise and fall of entire mountain ranges, watched continents slide slowly into new shapes, and sat through more ice ages than anyone has ever bothered to count, right up until one day, geologically speaking, it did not. Now, if you went looking for something like this in the ocean today, you would come back empty-handed almost everywhere you looked. Modern sea floors, the ones divers and submarines usually pass over, tend to be sandy open and a little lonely by comparison. What was once measured in the thousands of different kinds is now down to a modest handful, tucked away in places most of us will never visit. It is a bit like walking through a grand old ballroom. Decades after the last party ended, the chandeliers gone, the music long since stopped, only a few faint scuff marks left on the floor to prove anyone was ever dancing there at all. Whatever happened to this ancient garden did not just thin it out. It rewrote the rules of the entire seafloor, and we're going to spend the rest of this journey figuring out exactly how that happened. Here is what makes this story worth losing a little sleep over tonight, and I mean that in the best possible way. Somewhere right now underneath your own feet in the pale grey stone of a courtyard, the pillar of an old church or the polished floor of a building you have probably walked straight through without a second glance. Pieces of that ancient forest may still be resting there, pressed into solid rock, waiting for somebody to actually look down. Once you know what you're looking for, you may never look at an ordinary sidewalk the same way again. We're going to get to that. We're going to walk through cathedrals built without anyone quite realizing it at the time, from the bones of this exact garden. We're going to meet a quiet farm town in the middle of the United States that accidentally became the most important crinoid graveyard on the entire planet, and the 9-year-old boy who stumbled onto it while out looking for something else entirely. We're going to meet the small patient predators who learned to hunt this forest from the inside, and the strangers who moved in uninvited to live among the stork's freeloaders that scientists are to this day still arguing about. And we're going to find out how a creature that ruled the seafloor for tens of millions of years longer than the dinosaurs would later rule the land came within a breath of disappearing completely. But before any of that, before the cathedrals, the fossils and the almost, we should probably slow down and ask the one question none of us have actually answered yet, the one hiding in plain sight this whole time, swaying gently a few feet in front of us. If this thing is not a flower, and it is not really a plant, and it is not quite like anything swimming in our oceans today, then what exactly are we looking at? Let's get a little closer and find out. So here we are, close enough now that if you held perfectly still, you could probably watch the current moving through its arms, feel the faint pull of water, the same way it does sliding past your fingers, the same way it slides past its own. And the very first thing worth noticing, the detail most people miss entirely, is how wrong that word feels the moment you say it out loud. Arms, not petals. Arms. Because everything we have been calling a flower this whole time is without a shadow of a doubt an animal. And tonight we're going to take it apart piece by piece, the way you might turn an old pocket watch over in your hand, curious about what is actually ticking underneath the pretty face. No scalpels involved, I promise. Just a slow, careful look. Start at the bottom where it meets the seafloor. Most of these creatures anchor themselves with something called a holdfast, a small root-shaped clump that grips onto rock or shell debris and simply refuses to let go. From there, a long jointed stalk rises up through the water, built out of hundreds of tiny disc-shaped plates, stacked one on top of another almost like a roll of coins standing on its end. Each little disc has a name, a columnal, and here is a small fact worth holding on to for later, because we will come back to it more than once before this story is finished. Those discs separate easily after death. A single stalk can leave behind hundreds of them scattered across the seafloor, which is part of why hundreds of millions of years from now people walking along certain beaches would find these little stone rings without having the faintest idea what they were looking at. At the top of that stalk sits the part most of us would call the flower head, but scientists gave it a plainer name, the calyx, a small cup-shaped chamber that holds everything an animal actually needs to survive. A mouth, a gut. The basic machinery of being alive tucked away inside a shell built from stacked plates of its own, protecting the soft parts the way a helmet protects a skull. And rising out of that cup, branching and branching again, are the arms lined along their edges with tiny feathery filaments called pinnules, which is really just a fancier way of saying they look feathered, almost like the barbs on a bird's wing, except each one of those tiny filaments is doing actual work. Here's where it gets interesting, so stay with me for a second. Every one of those filaments is covered in microscopic tube feet, and those tube feet are coated in a thin layer of mucus, sticky enough to trap anything drifting past that happens to be edible. When the current runs through the crown, the whole structure opens itself into a shape scientists describe almost poetically. For people who usually avoid poetry as a parabolic filtration fan, the arms curving slightly to catch the flow, the way a satellite dish catches a signal, or maybe closer to home the way a spider builds a web and simply waits rather than chasing anything down. Anything smaller than roughly 0.2 of a millimeter plankton, tiny drifting scraps of organic matter, gets caught on that mucus, and tiny hair-like structures nudge it painstakingly one small step at a time, down a groove running the length of each arm all the way to the mouth waiting in the centre. No teeth, no chase, no struggle of any kind, just patience dressed up as elegance. And the sheer scale of that crown varies far more than you might expect walking into this. The simplest layout, the one you would likely draw if someone handed you a pencil and asked you to sketch one from memory, has exactly 5 arms branching directly out of the cup in a neat 5-pointed pattern. But 5 was never a hard limit, only a starting point. In many species, each of those 5 original arms splits again and again until a single crown ends up carrying dozens of smaller branches, sometimes edging toward 100 or more, always multiplying in 5s, never in 4s or 6s, as if the animal had quietly agreed to follow one unbreakable rule no matter how elaborate it eventually became. And the stalks holding all of that up were not shy about their height either. Some species kept things modest, barely taller than your hand. Others stretched their stalks several meters into the water column, tall enough that if you set one upright next to you, it would tower well over your head, waving somewhere above the tallest person you know. Which raises a fair question, one worth asking before we move on. If there is no brain running this operation, what exactly is deciding what gets eaten and what gets ignored? The honest answer is a little humbling. There is no brain at all, not the way you or I would recognize one, only a simple scattered network of nerves, spread through the arms and the cup, enough wiring to sense food close around it, and pass it along, but nothing close to a mind making choices. And here is a detail that always gets a small surprised laugh out of people the first time they hear it. The mouth and the exit sit almost right next to each other, both facing upward on that same small cup, which means, put plainly, the dining room and the restroom share a single wall. Efficient in its own blunt way. Elegant is probably the wrong word for that particular arrangement. Now I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think it matters more than it sounds like it should. Have you ever picked up a starfish at the beach, maybe as a kid, and noticed those strange little tube feet lining the underside, gripping your palm just slightly? If you have, you've technically already touched a distant cousin of everything we're talking about tonight, because both of them belong to the same wildly strange family tree, one that also includes sea urchins and sand dollars, a family with absolutely no plants anywhere in its branches. And that brings us to a mix-up worth clearing up properly, because I think it trips up more people than it probably should. It is easy glancing quickly at something with a stalk and a crown of waving arms to assume you're looking at some kind of coral, or maybe an anemone sitting quietly on a rock. It is an easy mistake to make, and honestly I made it myself the first time I ever looked at a photograph of one of these. But corals and anemones belong to an entirely different branch of the animal kingdom, one built around stinging cells lining their tentacles designed to paralyze anything unlucky enough to brush against them. What we're looking at tonight has no sting in it anywhere, not one cell. It does not hunt. It does not paralyze. It simply waits and filters and lets the ocean bring dinner directly to its door, which honestly might be the most patient survival strategy that has ever existed on this entire planet. And while we're clearing things up, here is a second mix-up worth putting to rest. Because it looks so much like a flower, it is tempting to assume it must live like one too, pulling energy from sunlight the way an actual plant would. It does not even a little. Every bit of energy running through that crown of arms comes from what it manages to catch drifting past in the current, not from the sun overhead. Take away the light entirely, drop it into total darkness, and so long as food still drifts by, it will carry on exactly as before. Take away the light from a real flower, on the other hand, and you have essentially signed its death warrant within days. There is another detail worth sitting with for a moment, something almost strange enough to feel like a magic trick, if you did not already know how biology tends to work. When this animal is still an infant drifting freely through open water as a tiny larva, its body is built the same way yours is, the same way almost every animal you can picture is, with a clear left side and a clear right side mirroring each other, symmetrical, the ordinary way. But somewhere in its short, strange childhood, it undergoes a transformation, settling down, attaching itself to the seafloor and rebuilding its entire body plan from the ground up into five-fold symmetry. Instead, the same repeating pattern you can count on any starfish if you are patient enough to look closely. It throws away the blueprint every other familiar animal follows and builds itself again from scratch into something shaped more like a wheel or a flower or a compass rose than anything with a front, a back, and two matching sides. I will be honest, there is something about that quiet total unbuilding and rebuilding of a body that unsettles me slightly even now, even after spending far too many nights reading about it. As for the material, all of this is actually made from that part matters too, more than you might expect from something that sounds like a footnote. The entire skeleton, the stalk, the calyx, every branching arm is built from a mineral called calcite, but not the ordinary kind you would find in a piece of chalk. This version carries an unusually high amount of magnesium mixed into its structure, which makes it noticeably tougher, almost like the animal engineered its own suit of armor out of the seawater around it. That toughness serves two very different purposes at once, and only one of them has anything to do with staying alive. The obvious one is defense, a bit of hardened resistance against anything that might want to take a bite. But the second purpose only reveals itself long after the animal has already died, because that same dense magnesium-rich structure happens to preserve extraordinarily well, locking itself into the rock record with a level of detail most soft-bodied creatures could only dream of. We're going to spend an entire chapter of this story on exactly how well and exactly how strange the results of that preservation turned out to be, but for tonight just tuck that detail somewhere in the back of your mind. One last piece of the puzzle before we step back and look at the whole picture together. For a long time, naturalists assumed these creatures spent their entire lives fixed to one single spot, planted the way an actual flower would be unable to so much as shift an inch in any direction. It turns out that is not entirely true. Some species, instead of a fixed root, grow small claw-like structures near the base called cirri, which can grip the seafloor release and grip again somewhere new, letting the animal shuffle itself slowly and deliberately toward a better patch of current if the one it is sitting in stops delivering enough food. Think of it less like walking and more like a chess piece that only ever moves when nobody happens to be watching, one careful square at a time, and then holds perfectly still again the moment it settles. It is not fast. It is nothing close to fast. But it is movement real and intentional, coming from something most of us would have sworn at a glance was rooted to the spot forever. Sit with that for a moment. An animal with no brain, no eyes in the way we understand them, no real face to speak of, and yet it can somehow sense a bad neighborhood and quietly relocate itself out of one. If you had to build a creature from nothing working with only a mouth, a handful of nerves and patience, would you have guessed it could still figure out when it was time to move house? So take a step back with me for a second and look at the whole shape of it. A stalk built from stacked stone discs, a cup-shaped chamber guarding a simple ancient set of organs running on nerves instead of any real mind. A crown of feathered arms coated in sticky microscopic traps, curved into the current like a satellite dish tuned to catch anything the ocean happens to be offering that day. An armor-plated skeleton doing double duty as both a shield in life and a perfect little time capsule in death. Small claw-like feet tucked away at the base capable of walking a creature most people would have assumed was rooted forever. What you're actually looking at underneath the soft outline of a flower is one of the most quietly ingenious feeding machines nature ever bothered to design. Wearing purely by coincidence the one disguise on this entire planet, gentle enough to make people stop reaching for a net and start reaching instead for a paintbrush, which raises a question worth sitting with while the current keeps moving past us. Something built this elegantly, this specifically for this particular way of living, did not simply appear out of nowhere on a random Tuesday in the middle of the Carboniferous. Something came before it, some earlier version cruder and stranger that had to exist, first get things wrong, and slowly figure its way toward this exact design. A much longer, much older story stretching back further than most people would ever guess, buried somewhere beneath the very seafloor we're standing on right now, waiting for us to go looking for where all of this actually began. Every good mystery worth chasing eventually asks you to walk backward instead of forward, and that is exactly what we're about to do. Not backward by a few years or even a few centuries. We're about to leave this particular garden entirely swim clean out of the world. We've been standing in for the last several minutes and keep going further back past the point where any of this seemed even remotely possible. Because nothing this well built shows up overnight, and I think you already sensed that. So let's rewind the tape a long way past the towering coal forests, past the giant dragonflies, past the entire Carboniferous world we've been wandering through so far, and keep rewinding until the water around us turns colder. The shoreline looks unfamiliar, and almost nothing alive would recognize a single creature swimming past. We're heading toward the very beginning of complicated life on this planet, a stretch of ocean roughly 500 million years old, back to a period most people only vaguely remember from a poster in a middle school science classroom, the Cambrian. There is a particular place tucked into the mountains of British Columbia in Canada called the Burgess Shale, and if you ever want to understand why paleontologists get a little starry-eyed talking about certain rock formations, this is a good place to start. Most of the time when something dies in the ocean, its soft parts simply rot away within days, leaving behind only the hard bits, shells, bones, the occasional stubborn fragment. But something strange happened along this particular stretch of ancient seafloor. A series of sudden mudslides buried entire communities of creatures, almost instantly sealing them away from the oxygen and the scavengers that would normally have picked them apart. It was without question the single worst afternoon any of those creatures ever had, and somehow several 100 million years later it turned into one of the luckiest breaks paleontology has ever caught. The result is a fossil bed so exquisitely preserved that scientists can sometimes still make out soft tissue, the outline of a gut, even traces of what an animal's last meal might have looked like. It is in a very real sense a photograph of a moment in time that was never supposed to survive, And tucked among all of that unlikely detail is a small, strange creature called Ecmatocrinus, considered by many researchers to be the earliest crinoid anyone has ever found. Picture something far more modest than the elegant meadow we've been exploring together, a simple, almost stubby little body, barely reaching past your palm, still working out the basic architecture that later generations would refine into something truly graceful. It is not much to look at, if we're being honest with each other, more of a lumpy little cushion on a short stalk than anything you would ever mistake for a flower. But everything we spent the last stretch of this story admiring, the stalk, the crown, the feeding arms curved patiently into the current, all of it traces its family history back to something like this: a rough draft. An early sketch scribbled out long before the artist figured out what they were actually trying to draw. Now here is where the story gets a little messier, and honestly I find that messiness kind of comforting. Scientists do not fully agree on exactly which older creature crinoids branched off from. One idea points toward a group called eocrinoids, small vase-shaped animals with stalks of their own already experimenting with life anchored to the seafloor. Another idea points toward a slightly different group called cystoids, close relatives with a body plan built along different lines. The honest answer, the one you will not usually hear delivered with much confidence in a museum placard, is that nobody currently alive knows for certain which branch is the correct one, and the debate has been quietly running for longer than most family arguments ever do. I happen to like that uncertainty, if I am honest. It means the story is not finished being written even now, even after all this time. Let me ask you something, just for a second before we keep moving. If you tried to count backward through your own family one generation at a time, mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, how far do you think you would actually get before the names ran out and the trail went cold? Most of us hit a wall within a few generations, maybe a century or two, if a relative kept excellent records. Now try applying that same counting exercise to this animal. Instead of your own family generation after generation stretching back, not through decades, but through hundreds of millions of years, long before anything resembling a flower had ever grown on land, long before there were forests of any kind anywhere on the planet, coal or otherwise. It is the kind of number that stops being a number after a while and starts being closer to a feeling. From that rough, stubby little starting point, things did not stay quiet for long. Roughly 40 million years after Ecmatocrinus first showed up, the oceans of the planet went through something scientists now describe almost breathlessly as an explosion, though nothing actually caught fire. It is usually called the Great Biodiversification of the Ordovician period, and the plain English version of that mouthful is simple enough. Life in the sea, almost all at once on a geological timescale, started trying out an enormous number of new shapes, new strategies, new ways of making a living on the seafloor or drifting through open water. Crinoids were right in the middle of that creative burst, branching out into dozens upon dozens of different lineages, each one quietly experimenting with a slightly different version of the same basic blueprint we walked through earlier. Some grew taller stalks, some grew shorter, squatter bodies built low and sturdy against the current. Some tried crowns with only a handful of arms, others pushed toward crowns dense enough to look almost furry from a distance. It was not a single tidy invention. It was closer to an entire design studio suddenly getting funded all at once, every young architect in the building given free rein to sketch whatever came to mind. Paleontologists eventually needed a filing system just to keep track of all the experimentation, sorting the growing family tree into a handful of broad branches, each one leaning toward its own particular habits and body shapes. I will spare you the technical names, honestly, because they read more like a dusty index card than a bedtime story, and the labels themselves matter far less than the plain staggering fact underneath them. In a fairly short stretch of geological time, this animal went from a single rough sketch buried in a mudslide to an entire sprawling family reunion, cousins in every shape imaginable, all pulling up chairs to the same shallow sunlit seas. Here is a detail worth sitting with because it says something about the character of this animal long before it ever built a forest. The ocean during these early hundreds of millions of years was not a peaceful place to practice being alive. Several catastrophic extinction events swept across the planet during this stretch, wiping out staggering percentages of everything living in the sea at the time. One of them, a brutal cold snap, roughly 445 million years ago, froze large portions of the global ocean and erased an estimated 85% of all marine species then alive. Try to picture what that would have actually looked like from the seafloor if anyone had been around to see it, a once crowded neighbourhood reduced almost overnight in geological terms to something closer to a house after a firewall still standing here and there but unmistakably emptied out. Crinoids took losses in that event too. Plenty of individual branches on the family tree simply stopped existing. But the design itself, the basic idea of a stalked filter-feeding animal shaped like a flower, survived, dusted itself off and kept diversifying afterward, as though nothing had happened. It would not be the last close call either. Tens of millions of years later, right around the very end of the period just before the Carboniferous begins, another wave of extinction swept through the oceans, stretched out over what researchers believe were repeated pulses rather than one single blow, battering marine life again and again over roughly 20 million years. Reef-building creatures were hit especially hard during that stretch, entire ecosystems built around coral simply collapsing in places. And once again, sitting quietly through the wreckage, this same stubborn, patient body plan came out the other side largely intact, arriving at the doorstep of the Carboniferous, a little thinner in numbers perhaps, but very much still standing ready for what was about to become its finest hour. I want to pause on that for a moment because I think it is easy to breeze past a sentence like that without really letting it land. This was not one lucky species getting through one bad afternoon. This was an entire body plan, an entire way of living surviving multiple planetary catastrophes spaced tens of millions of years apart, each one bad enough to be remembered today as one of the worst extinction events in the entire history of life on Earth. If you wanted to design an animal purely for the purpose of outlasting disaster after disaster, you could honestly do a lot worse than this exact shape, sitting quietly filtering whatever drifted by, asking for almost nothing from the world around it. There is a small lesson buried in there if you're willing to look for it, and it has nothing to do with speed or strength or sharp teeth. Nothing about this animal was built to fight its way through a catastrophe. It never developed armor thick enough to shrug off a predator or legs fast enough to outrun anything. What it had instead was modesty, an almost stubborn willingness to ask very little of the world and keep asking for that little bit patiently year after year, disaster after disaster. Sometimes that turns out to be worth more than teeth ever were. Would you have guessed, looking at something this delicate, that patience alone could carry a body plan across nearly 500 million years of planetary chaos? By the time we finally arrive back at the Carboniferous world, we have spent this whole story exploring the animal we met earlier tonight, is no longer some rough early sketch clinging to survival after a mudslide. It has had roughly 200 million years of practice. 200 million years of near misses and quiet refinements to become the confident, densely packed, endlessly varied garden we started with. In fact, paleontologists studying this particular stretch of time have their own private nickname for it, one you will not often hear outside a university lecture hall or a dusty museum archive. They call the early half of the Carboniferous the stretch when these creatures reach their absolute peak of abundance and variety, the age of crinoids, not the age of fish, not the age of anything with a backbone at all. A quiet stretch of geological time named informally after a filter-feeding animal shaped like a flower, because for tens of millions of years, more than almost anything else alive in the ocean, this was simply their world. And there is something almost funny about that if you think about it long enough. We name eras after dinosaurs, after mammals, after ourselves, always reaching for something dramatic, something with teeth or claws, or a good origin story worth putting on a movie poster. And yet here is a stretch of Earth's history that truly belonged more than anything else to something that spends its entire life standing still, waiting patiently for the ocean to bring it dinner. No roar, no chase scene, just an unbroken, quiet dominance stretched across an amount of time that makes most of what we consider ancient history look almost freshly printed by comparison. It is worth remembering, too, that this animal did not know any of what we know now, sitting here looking backward with the entire outline of the story already laid out in front of us. It had no way of knowing it had survived a global freeze or a string of extinction pulses stretched across 20 million years, or that scientists 500 million years later would still be arguing over its exact family tree. It simply kept doing the one thing it had always done, opening its arms into the current one slow season at a time, and somehow that turned out to be enough. So now that we know where this animal came from and roughly how long it had been quietly perfecting itself before the scene we open this story with ever existed, it is worth asking a slightly bigger question, one that has been sitting patiently in the background this entire time waiting its turn. What exactly did the rest of that Carboniferous world actually look like above the water, as much as below it in the exact moment this ancient battle-tested garden was finally reaching its peak? Let's actually surface for a moment, break through into open air, take a breath and take a proper look around, because it turns out the story sitting just above the waterline is every bit as strange as the one swaying beneath it. The first thing you would notice if you could somehow stand on dry ground in this particular moment of Earth's history is that the ground itself is still being decided. The continents have not settled into the shapes any of us grew up memorizing on a classroom map. They are drifting slowly toward each other, instead grinding and colliding their way into a single enormous landmass that geologists later named Pangaea, one great supercontinent, hugging most of the world's dry land into a single sprawling shape. That collision is not just background scenery either. It is doing something enormous to the climate, squeezing and reshaping the way ocean currents move around the globe, blocking pathways that used to let warm and cool water mix freely and redirecting rainfall into patterns unlike anything the planet had produced before. And as we'll come back to before this part is finished, it turns out to be the quiet architect behind almost everything else we're about to describe, on land and underwater both. Picture warm, humid lowlands stretching along the tropical belt of that supercontinent, soaked through with slow-moving rivers and standing water that rarely, if ever, fully dries out, not unlike the bayous and river deltas you might picture somewhere along the American Gulf Coast today, except stretched across an entire hemisphere and left to grow undisturbed for tens of millions of years. Towering plants crowd together here, some reaching heights that would put a 10-story building to shame their trunks, nothing like the wood we know today, closer to a kind of scaled, almost reptilian bark wrapped around a soft, spongy interior. Ferns the size of trees fill in the gaps beneath them. There would be sound here too, a constant low hum of insects working through the humid air, and a smell thick and green and faintly sulphurous rising off standing water that never quite finishes decomposing whatever falls into it. The air itself would feel different against your skin, thick, warm, faintly metallic, carrying noticeably more oxygen than anything your lungs have ever actually breathed. And the extra oxygen matters more than you might expect, because it may be the reason this particular patch of forest floor is patrolled by creatures that look like they wandered in from someone's fever dream. Somewhere above the canopy, a dragonfly cuts through the humid air wings stretching out to nearly the length of your forearm, closer to the wingspan of a hawk than anything you would ever swat away from a picnic table. Its name, when scientists finally got around to naming it centuries later, was Meganeura. Though it turns out an even larger cousin existed too, one we'll come back to in a moment, a detail most documentaries conveniently leave out, because a single tidy record holder makes for a cleaner story. Down on the forest floor, something else is moving through the leaf litter. Longer than a fully grown man is tall, its body divided into dozens of overlapping armoured segments, each one lined with legs. Arthropleura, a distant, wildly oversized ancestor of the modern millipede, stretching past 2.5 meters from end to end, roughly 6 times the length of the largest millipede alive today. Despite the armor and the sheer size of it, most researchers now believe the animal spent its days doing something almost disappointingly gentle, grazing on leaf litter and spores rather than hunting anything down, which tells you something about how easy to please survival could actually be, back when nothing quite that large had yet learned to fear anything else. And nearby, tucked under a fallen log, a scorpion the size of a house cat waits patiently in the shadows, its stinger raised in no particular hurry, which is somehow a far more unsettling image than one that is actually in a hurry. Now here is where I have to pump the brakes a little, because for a long time the explanation for all of this gigantism sounded almost too tidy to question. The textbook version goes like this. Insects breathe through a network of tiny tubes running directly through their bodies, rather than through lungs the way we do, and that method of breathing puts a hard ceiling on how large an insect can physically grow before oxygen simply cannot reach its core fast enough. More oxygen in the surrounding air, the story goes, raises that ceiling, and since the atmosphere during this stretch of time carried noticeably more oxygen than our own insects were free to grow enormous, it is a clean explanation. It fits neatly into a single sentence, and for decades it was treated almost like settled fact, which raises a fair question of its own. Honestly, one worth pausing on before we go any further. Nobody was standing there with an instrument measuring the air 300 million years ago, so how would anyone today actually know the atmosphere carried more oxygen in the first place? The answer, it turns out, is written into the rock itself in the form of charcoal. Wildfires need oxygen to burn, and the higher the oxygen content of the surrounding air, the more easily even damp, half-rotten vegetation will catch and burn instead of merely smouldering out. Layers of ancient charcoal preserved in rock formations from this stretch of time show up far more frequently and in far greater volume than anything found in rock laid down before or after. It is a strange kind of proof, reading the ashes of forest fires that happened hundreds of millions of years ago, to reconstruct exactly what was in the air the moment they started burning, but it is proof all the same, and it is part of why the elevated oxygen theory, even with its recent complications, has never been fully abandoned. But here is the twist that recent research keeps circling back to, and I think it is worth sitting with for a second instead of rushing past it. If elevated oxygen alone explained the gigantism, these giant flying insects should have shrunk the moment oxygen levels eventually dropped. Except some of the largest griffinflies ever discovered, a cousin of Meganeura carrying a wingspan nearly a full meter across, actually show up later in rock layers from after oxygen levels had already started falling. Here is a detail that tends to surprise people even more once they hear it. Despite that enormous wingspan, researchers estimate the animal weighed somewhere around 100 grams, roughly the weight of a smartphone, which means the picture most of us carry around in our heads. Some lumbering, heavy-bodied monster crashing through the canopy is probably closer to a very large, very lightweight kite than anything resembling a flying brick. That single detail is a genuine problem for the tidy version of the story. Newer research has started pointing toward other explanations working alongside the oxygen, maybe even ahead of it. Things like the near-total absence of birds or bats in the sky at the time, meaning nothing fast or aerial was hunting these insects down, or shifts in climate and ecosystem pressure that simply rewarded larger bodies for a while. The honest answer, the one that actually respects how science works, is that nobody has fully closed the case yet. I happen to find that far more interesting than a single confident sentence ever could be. Let me ask you something honestly before we move any further into this. If you had to walk through a forest like that yourself, hawk-sized dragonflies overhead, 2.5-meter-long millipedes underfoot, a house cat-sized scorpion somewhere in the leaf litter, would you have lasted 5 minutes, or would you have turned right back around toward the water we just climbed out of? I will be honest about my own answer. I like to imagine myself being brave about it, calmly cataloguing everything I saw, notebook in hand. Realistically, I think I would have made it about 10 steps before deciding the ocean-stinging jellyfish, unnamed predators, and all suddenly sounded like the safer option. Here is the detail that made this whole stretch of time famous, the one most people already have some vague memory of from school, even if the details got fuzzy along the way. All of that plant material, generation after generation of towering trees and ferns, piling up in these warm, waterlogged lowlands, eventually became coal, vast seams of it, thick enough in places to still be mined today, hundreds of millions of years later, warming homes and running factories on a completely different continent in a completely different age of the world. And for a long time the explanation offered for exactly why so much coal built up here, more than during almost any other stretch of Earth's entire history, sounded almost like a children's story. Fungi, the story goes, simply had not figured out yet how to break down the tough woody material inside these plants. There was a gap, supposedly tens of millions of years wide, between plants inventing sturdy trunks and fungi inventing a way to digest them, and during that gap dead wood simply piled up faster than anything could, rotted away, stacking higher and higher, decade after decade, with nothing waiting on the forest floor to say enough. It is a lovely story. It shows up in documentaries constantly taught with total confidence, repeated so often it has practically become common knowledge. And a fairly recent careful study digging back through the actual chemistry of preserved coal samples from across an entire continent found that the story does not really hold up. Wood-rotting fungi appear to have existed well before this period, and more tellingly, plenty of the coal itself turns out to be built from plants that never contained much of the tough material in question to begin with. So if it was not a missing decomposer holding the process back, what was it? The far more likely explanation, according to that research, has nothing to do with fungi falling behind at all, and everything to do with the exact geography. We already mentioned a moment ago the low-lying, waterlogged coastal lowlands, created specifically by the way Pangaea was assembling itself, wetlands that stayed wet generation after generation, for tens of millions of years without a meaningful break, giving dead plant material nowhere to go, except down layer after layer, compressing under its own weight into peat and eventually coal. Which brings us back around to that same supercontinent, because it turns out this is not really two separate stories at all. The very same tectonic squeeze that built these endless waterlogged coastal lowlands on land was at almost the exact same moment cutting off large stretches of open ocean circulation elsewhere on the globe, pooling warm, shallow, sunlit water into vast inland seas along the tropical margins of that same drifting landmass. One geological event, two completely different nurseries. On one side, slow rivers and dead trees stacking up into something that would one day heat a house. On the other, warm, still water settling into exactly the kind of shallow, food-rich shelf where a certain patient flower-shaped animal had already been quietly waiting for its moment for roughly 200 million years. I think that is the detail that gets left out of almost every version of this story, and honestly, it might be my favourite piece of the entire puzzle so far. We tend to picture the coal forests and the Crinoid meadows as two unrelated backdrops that simply happen to exist during the same vague stretch of prehistory, like two separate movie sets standing side by side. They were not separate at all. They were the same continent buckling and settling into a single new shape, writing two very different endings for two very different kinds of life, using the exact same geological pen. Ask yourself this for a second. If one slow, grinding collision of continents could quietly decide the fate of two entirely different worlds, at once one destined to burn in furnaces thousands of centuries later, the other destined to end up polished into cathedral floors, what does that actually tell you about how much of what feels like separate history is secretly the same story told twice in two different languages? So while those hawk-sized dragonflies were carving through the humid air above the coal swamps, and while that armoured millipede was working its way through the undergrowth below them, something equally strange, equally crowded, and honestly far less talked about was unfolding just beneath the surface of the water, lapping at the edge of that same continent. And that is exactly where we are headed next, back beneath the waves, to see how an entire underwater population, sitting shoulder to shoulder across miles of shallow seafloor, somehow organised itself tier upon tier into what might be the strangest kind of forest this planet has ever grown. Back beneath the surface then, and this time instead of just admiring the view, I want you to actually study it the way an architect might study a building, instead of just walking through the lobby, running a hand along the walls, checking what is actually holding the whole thing up. Because underneath all that swaying feathered beauty there is a floor plan hiding in plain sight, and once you see it, you will not be able to unsee it. Here is the puzzle we left dangling a moment ago. Picture millions of these animals packed into the same shallow stretch of seafloor, all of them doing the exact same thing at the exact same time, reaching their arms into the exact same current fishing for the exact same tiny scraps of food drifting past. That should be a disaster, honestly. Imagine an entire town showing up to the same single food truck at the same moment every single day forever. No line, no rotation, everyone reaching for the same window at once. Somebody would starve. Something has to give. And something did give, although it took evolution a very long time patiently, generation after generation to work out the solution. The answer turned out to be height. Think about what it actually means for an animal that cannot move to compete with its neighbour for food. It cannot chase anything away. It cannot claim more territory by force. The only lever available to it, the only thing it can actually change about its own situation, is how far up into the water column its arms happen to reach. A stork even a little taller than the one standing next to it gets first access to whatever the current is carrying catching food before it ever reaches the crown below. Over enough generations, that small, almost trivial advantage compounds into something much larger, and eventually, instead of every crinoid in the neighbourhood competing at exactly the same height, the population spreads itself out vertically. Instead, each slight variation in stalk length finding its own, slightly less crowded slice of the current to call its own. Different species of crinoids sitting side by side in the very same patch of seafloor, ended up growing their stalks to dramatically different lengths, some barely rising above the mud, no taller than your finger tucked low, where the current ran slow and calm, others stretching well up into the water column, a full arm's length or more overhead, reaching for a completely different layer of the current entirely faster moving, carrying a different mix of drifting food along with it. Instead of every single animal competing for the exact same mouthful of drifting plankton, the community effectively split itself into stacked levels, each one skimming a slightly different slice of the water passing overhead. Scientists have a fairly plain, unglamorous name for this arrangement. They call it tiering, and if you want a mental picture that actually captures it, forget the word forest for a second, and think instead about an apartment building. Same address, same general neighborhood, but the resident on the ground floor and the resident on the top floor are in practice living almost entirely separate lives, each one catching a different draft of air through a different window. I find something quietly remarkable about that. Honestly, the idea that an animal with no brain, no eyes, nothing you or I would recognize as a plan, somehow arrived purely through trial and error, stretched across unthinkable spans of time, at the exact same solution a human city planner might reach for after years of study. Nobody sat these creatures down and explained the concept of dividing up a limited resource. The ones that happened to grow slightly taller or slightly shorter than their neighbors simply ate a little better, survived a little longer, and passed that slight difference along generation after generation, until an entire community had sorted itself, almost without anyone deciding anything, into a structure that worked. And since we're already talking about apartment buildings, I am curious if you actually had to pick a floor in this particular building, current rushing past, food drifting by in an endless silent supply, would you take the calm, sheltered ground floor or reach for the faster, richer current higher up? I think I already know which one I would pick, and it is not the one that sounds more adventurous. Now here is a fair question worth asking, and I promise the answer is worth the wait. How would anyone today actually know this happened? Know for certain that different species really were stacked at different heights, rather than just scattered randomly across the mud, all their stalks collapsed and jumbled together the instant they died. Ordinarily, that is exactly the problem. Once one of these animals dies, its stalk tends to fall apart within days, scattering into loose discs across the seafloor, which means most fossil beds give you a pile of disconnected pieces, rather than a clean-standing record of who was living where. It turns out there is one particular place on this planet where that usual problem simply did not happen, where an entire community got frozen in time with almost impossible precision, dozens of species captured mid-stride, so to speak, heights intact, allowing scientists to measure the whole vertical structure directly, rather than guess at it from scattered debris. That discovery deserves its own telling in full a little further along in this story, so hold on to that thought, because we are absolutely coming back to it. For now though, let's stay with the bigger picture, because tiering is really only the beginning of what this crowded seafloor was quietly accomplishing. Have you ever stood at the edge of a slow-moving river and noticed how the water near a fallen tree branch or a cluster of reeds moves differently than the open current a few feet away, slower, calmer, carrying less sediment along with it? Something similar was happening here, except on a scale spanning entire stretches of coastline. Millions of stalks packed shoulder to shoulder acted as a kind of living windbreak against the current, physically slowing the water passing through the meadow and encouraging fine sediment to settle out of it, rather than keep tumbling along the sea floor. That single shift water slowing down just enough to drop what it was carrying would have quietly reworked the character of the seafloor itself. Over time, softer, finer sediment, building up beneath the meadow than you would find on the open, unprotected stretches nearby. Ecologists have a term for a creature that reshapes its own environment simply by existing in large enough numbers. They call it an ecosystem engineer, and it is not a title reserved only for the obvious examples: beavers damming a stream, earthworms turning over soil. Modern kelp forests do something remarkably similar, calming the surf enough for entire nurseries of smaller fish to shelter among the fronds and seagrass meadows. Do it too, trapping loose sand with their roots, the way a quilt holds its stuffing in place. Long before either of those existed anywhere on the planet, this quiet, stalked animal was already doing the same essential job with nothing more than sheer numbers and a body built to stand still. Let me pause here and clear up a mix-up I think trips up more people than it probably should, because I made this same assumption myself for longer than I would like to admit. It is tempting, looking at a dense, colourful community like this one stretching across the seafloor for miles, to reach for the word reef. It certainly behaves a little like one. It shelters other creatures, it shapes the current, it builds up thick rocky deposits over time. But a true reef, in the strict sense geologists use the word, is something more specific. A rigid, cemented framework. Individual skeletons physically fused together into one continuous load-bearing structure, the way coral colonies interlock brick by living brick into something closer to a single organism wearing 1,000 faces. What we are describing here is different and honestly a little stranger once you sit with it. These were not fused together at all. Each stalk stood on its own, an individual animal rooted to the mud, crowded shoulder to shoulder with its neighbours purely by sheer density, rather than by any physical connection between them, packed in tight enough, in places that the arrangement probably felt a little like standing shoulder to shoulder on a crowded subway platform, everybody present, everybody occupying their own small patch of space, nobody actually welded to the person standing next to them. Less a coral reef, more an enormous silent crowd standing shoulder to shoulder in the same square, never quite touching. And there is a reason that particular kind of crowd got to take over the neighbourhood in the first place, one that traces right back to something we already touched on earlier in this story. The classic reef builders, the corals and colonial creatures that normally would have claimed this kind of shallow sunlit real estate for themselves, had already been hit hard by that same string of extinction pulses we discussed arriving right at the doorstep of this very period. Picture for a moment what that stretch of coastline might have looked like in the immediate aftermath before this particular garden had fully moved in. Bare limestone rubble here and there, the ghostly broken remains of older reef structures that never quite recovered wide stretches of open sunlit seafloor with almost nothing standing on it at all. A kind of vacant lot stretched across an entire coastline, waiting for somebody, anybody, to show up and start building again, with the usual architects of the reef world thinned out and struggling to rebuild the shallow seafloor, was left standing mostly vacant, and crinoids, patient, undemanding, and already excellent at multiplying wherever conditions allowed, simply moved into the space nobody else was using. It is less a story of conquest and more a story of remarkably good timing, an entire empire built less on ferocity than on simply showing up in overwhelming numbers exactly when the neighbourhood happened to be empty. I keep coming back to that phrase good timing because I think it says something worth sitting with for a moment. We tend to imagine the biggest, longest-lasting successes in the natural world as stories of raw power, the fastest predator, the toughest shell, the sharpest claw. This is a story about something else entirely, an animal that never had to fight anyone for the space it eventually filled, because it simply had the patience and the sheer numbers to walk in the moment the door was left open. There is no dramatic battle here, No clash between two rival empires fighting over the same stretch of seafloor. Just one group that happened to already be standing nearby, ready and unbothered exactly when a vacancy opened up that had taken millions of years and a global catastrophe to create. If you had to bet on which strategy actually lasts longer across deep time brute force or quiet persistence, which way would you put your money honestly? After everything we have already seen tonight, try to hold the whole picture in your mind for a second before we move on. A seafloor stretching for miles sorted invisibly into stacked levels by height, the water itself slowed and reshaped by nothing more than sheer crowded presence, and the entire structure standing not because anything fought its way into existence, but because it patiently filled a vacancy nobody else was ready to claim. It is without question one of the strangest neighborhoods this planet has ever built for itself. And once you start thinking about it as an actual neighborhood with actual floors and actual foot traffic, the next question practically asks itself. Every one of those tiers calm and shadowed down near the mud, brighter and busier, higher up in the open current would have offered a slightly different set of conditions, different light, different water speed, different shelter from anything hunting nearby. A structure built that carefully, whether or not it meant to, does not stay unoccupied for long. No neighborhood, however strange, exists in complete isolation, and this one was no exception. Other creatures noticed the shelter, the current, the sheer abundance of food drifting through this densely packed meadow and moved in right alongside the crinoids, some welcome, some far less, so some looking for a place to hide and at least one looking for something closer to a free meal. Which brings us quite naturally to the question of exactly who else was living here, tucked among the stalks sharing the same crowded address. Turns out the answer to that question is a fairly long list, and honestly some of the neighbours on it are stranger than the crinoids themselves, which is really saying something at this point in the evening. Grab a slightly wider view of the seafloor for a moment past just the swaying stalks we've been studying so closely, and you start to notice all the other shapes tucked into the gaps between them, quiet, easy to miss, and every single one of them with its own peculiar story attached. Let's start with the quiet ones. The roommates who never really cause trouble, the sort you would not even notice sharing the building with you unless you happen to look closely. Scattered among the crinoid stalks clinging to old shells, dead coral fragments, even the crinoids themselves were small colonies of an animal, with a name that sounds almost like an insult moss animals, though nobody meant it that way, and honestly the name has never quite done them justice. Each individual member of one of these colonies is remarkably tiny, smaller than a grain of rice, and on its own it would hardly be worth mentioning. But these particular animals never really live on their own. They build outward from themselves, budding off identical copies, cementing each new copy directly onto the last, until an entire colony has grown into a single shared skeleton, housing thousands of individual genetically identical residents, at once, each one going about its own small, separate life while permanently attached to every relative it will ever have. Some of those colonies fan out flat and lacy, almost like a piece of frozen sea foam. Others branch upward in narrow, twiggy fingers, or bunch together into small knobby lumps barely bigger than a walnut. From a short distance, scattered among the swaying crinoid stalks, they would have looked almost like a low patchy undergrowth, growing beneath the taller stalks above them, a forest floor tucked inside an underwater forest. The kind of quiet, unremarkable neighbour you only really notice once somebody points it out to you. Here is where it gets truly interesting though, because these tiny colonial animals were not eating the same way the crinoids around them were eating, even though they were competing for a lot of the same drifting scraps of food. Instead of feathered arms coated in sticky mucus, each individual member of the colony extends a small ring-shaped crown of tentacles, shaped almost like a miniature horseshoe sweeping water past itself and pulling in whatever happens to be small enough to catch. It is filter feeding again, the same basic strategy we've already spent a long time exploring tonight, but built from a completely different toolkit arrived at independently by a completely different branch of the animal kingdom. I find that detail almost funny, honestly. Two totally unrelated creatures sharing the same square footage of seafloor, both making a living the exact same way, using body parts that share nothing in common except the job they were built to do, now sitting right alongside those colonies, sometimes cemented to the rocks, sometimes anchored by a short, fleshy stalk of their own, was a creature that has caused more confusion among casual beachcombers than almost anything else in this entire story. At a glance, it looks exactly like a clam, two matching shells hinged together, closed tight against the current. If you found one washed up on a modern beach without knowing any better, you would toss it into the same mental bucket as every other seashell you have ever picked up, and you would be wrong in a way that turns out to be far more interesting than being right. Because this creature called a brachiopod is not a mollusk at all, and its shell is not built the same way a clam's is, even though it looks almost identical from a few feet away. A clam's two shells mirror each other, left side matching right side, hinged along the top like a book resting on its spine, so that if you slice straight down the hinge, each half of the book would be a perfect twin of the other. A brachiopod's two shells are different from each other, one usually larger and more curved than its partner, but each individual shell is symmetrical straight down its own center line top, mirroring bottom instead of left mirroring right, more like folding a single greeting card in half than opening a book along its spine. It sounds like a small technical distinction, and honestly it kind of is. But it also means an entire completely separate branch of the tree of life independently stumbled onto the exact same basic disguise a clam wears, two hinged shells protecting a soft body inside without either lineage ever borrowing the idea from the other. Nature, it turns out, keeps reaching for the same handful of good ideas again and again from completely different directions, whether it is a flower-shaped, filter-feeding animal that is secretly nothing like a flower, or a clam-shaped, filter-feeding animal that is secretly nothing like a clam. Let me ask you something actually, because I am curious how many of you have picked up a fossil like this without realizing what you were actually holding. If you have ever walked along a creek bed or a quarry wall anywhere in the middle of the United States and found a small ridged fan-shaped shell pressed into grey rock, there is a fairly good chance it was one of these, a brachiopod, quietly posing as a clam for roughly 300 million years and fooling almost everyone who ever picked it up. And then there is the roommate that gives even seasoned fossil collectors trouble, because unlike the bryozoans and the brachiopods, this one is not just filling a similar role in the same neighbourhood. It is closer to family, close enough that early researchers occasionally mix the two up entirely. Picture something built along almost exactly the same architecture as the crinoids we have spent so long exploring tonight. A stalk, rising off the seafloor, topped with a rounded body. If somebody handed you a handful of mixed fossils from this exact stretch of seafloor and asked you to sort the crinoids from the imposters, I promise you within the first minute you would set at least one of these into the wrong pile. But look closer and the differences start to show. Instead of a cup-shaped calyx opening into a crown of long branching arms, this creature carries something closer to a tight bud-shaped chamber, smooth and compact, almost like a closed tulip that never quite got around to blooming. And rather than feeding arms, it relies on a small star-shaped pattern of grooves, running across the surface of that bud, 5 points meeting at the centre, gathering food along tiny channels instead of catching it on a crown of waving limbs. These are called blastoids, and this particular stretch of time happens to be the exact moment they reach their absolute peak of variety and abundance. blooming, if you will allow me the pun, at precisely the same historical moment as the crinoids they so closely resembled. I like to imagine what it would have taken back when naturalists first started pulling these things out of the rock layer after layer cup shapes and bud shapes, tangled together in the same slab of stone to actually sort out which was which. It must have felt a little like being handed a box of family photographs with no names written on the back, close cousins standing shoulder to shoulder in every frame, distinguishable only once you knew exactly what small detail to look for. More than one early collector cataloguing drawers full of these things by candlelight almost certainly filed a blastoid under the wrong name entirely, and honestly I do not think anyone should judge them too harshly for it. Some mistakes take a very long stretch of careful patient looking to finally correct. So here is the bigger question worth sitting with for a moment now that we have met a few of the neighbours properly. How does a patch of seafloor this crowded actually support this many different residents, all reaching for a version of the same basic resource without the whole system collapsing into open competition? We already talked about height, about different stalks reaching into different layers of the current, but height is only part of the answer. The other part comes down to exactly how each resident actually catches its food. Mucus-coated tube feet here, a ring of tentacles there, a star-shaped groove somewhere else entirely, each one tuned to intercept a slightly different size, shape or speed of drifting particle. A crinoid's sticky arms might snag something a little larger, a little slower moving, while a bryozoan colony's tentacle rings, packed together by the thousand, could sieve out something finer, closer to dust suspended in the water. Layer that on top of the height differences we already covered, and the neighbourhood stops looking crowded in any meaningful sense at all. It starts looking closer to a carefully sorted pantry, everybody reaching for a slightly different shelf, at a slightly different height, using a slightly different set of hands. It is a little like an entire neighbourhood of restaurants sitting on the same street, all technically serving the same basic ingredient, and somehow none of them going out of business because each one is quietly specialising in a slightly different dish. One doing something delicate with the smallest scraps, another built for heartier portions, all of them somehow keeping their doors open on the exact same block for tens of millions of years running. If you had to run one of those restaurants yourself, forced to pick a single specialty, and stick with it for the rest of your life, would you go delicate and precise, or would you rather deal in bigger, heartier portions and hope the current keeps bringing customers your way? There is something almost touching about that if you think about it long enough. An entire community of wildly different creatures, none of them able to see each other, none of them capable of anything resembling a conversation, somehow settling into a shared arrangement that let all of them survive side by side for tens of millions of years. No treaties, no borders drawn in the sand, no committee meeting anywhere deciding who gets which shelf. Just an enormous number of small patient adjustments repeated across countless generations until the whole crowded neighbourhood simply worked, each resident quietly minding its own narrow slice of the water column and its own narrow slice of the available food, bumping shoulders occasionally perhaps, but never quite stepping on each other's toes long enough to actually matter. I think that is worth sitting with for a second, honestly, especially set against how we usually picture survival working in the natural world. We are conditioned to imagine an ecosystem as a battlefield, one species clawing its way over another, only the strongest making it through to the next generation. What this particular seafloor actually shows us looks a great deal more like a crowded, well-run apartment complex than a battlefield, full tenants, thin walls, and somehow remarkably very few actual fights. But I should be honest with you, because not every visitor who moved into this particular neighbourhood was quite so easy to live alongside. So far, every roommate we have met tonight has been in its own quiet way, minding its own business, filtering its own patch of water, causing no more trouble than a neighbour who keeps oddly specific gardening hours. That peaceful picture is about to get a little more complicated. Some of what settled in among these stalks was not filtering the water at all. Some of it was hungry in a much more direct sense, watching, waiting, drifting closer, with an entirely different set of intentions. And some of it had learned an even stranger trick, treating the crinoids themselves not as neighbours sharing a street, but as landlords to be quietly, patiently taken advantage of, living directly on their bodies and letting somebody else do all the hard work of finding dinner. Which is exactly where we are headed next, into the far less peaceful side of life in this crowded, swaying garden, where not everybody who moved in next door turned out to be quite as harmless as they first appeared. For nearly 2 centuries now, one particular relationship tucked into this crowded seafloor has managed to fool almost everyone who studied it, myself included for a good while, until I actually sat down and read past the first paragraph of the story. It is the kind of correction that makes you a little suspicious of every other tidy explanation you have ever accepted without question. And honestly, I think that suspicion is a healthy thing to carry into the rest of tonight. Picture a small, unassuming snail, its shell curled into a low rounded dome settled directly onto the top of a crinoid's cup, right where the animal's waste would normally exit into the current, fitted so snugly against the surface, it almost looks grown there rather than simply attached. For well over 100 years, the accepted explanation for this arrangement sounded almost sweet in its own strange way. This snail, everyone assumed, was simply catching a free meal, politely stationed by the exit, feeding on whatever the crinoid happened to expel harming. Nothing taking nothing the crinoid actually needed. Scientists even had a tidy word for it: coprophagy, a fancy way of saying the snail ate the crinoid's leftovers and left it at that. It painted a rather charming picture. Honestly, 2 creatures quietly sharing a single address, one filtering the water, the other cleaning up afterward, an odd little partnership nobody thought twice about disturbing. The sort of detail that shows up in an old museum placard and simply gets repeated unchallenged for generation after generation of visitors. Except the more closely researchers looked decades later, the less that tidy explanation actually held together. Careful comparisons started turning up crinoids with these snails attached that were on average noticeably smaller and less developed than crinoids of the exact same species living just a few feet away. Without one, a pattern that is difficult to explain if the relationship really was as harmless as everyone assumed. Then came a more unsettling detail still. In some specimens, instead of simply perching near the opening, the snail had drilled straight through the wall of the crinoid's cup, boring a small, precise hole directly into the soft tissue inside, occasionally more than one hole in the same unlucky individual, evidence that whatever it wanted, it was not content to simply wait by the door for it. And in a handful of cases, that drill hole showed clear evidence of healing new material grown back around the wound, meaning the crinoid had survived the intrusion rather than being killed outright by it. That is not the behaviour of a polite houseguest cleaning up crumbs by the back door. That is the behaviour of something actively feeding on its host, tapping directly into the crinoid's own tissue, or reproductive material drilling in for a meal it had no business collecting. I find that reversal almost irresistible, honestly, the idea that an entire scientific community spent the better part of a century calling something a peaceful roommate before slowly, reluctantly admitting it might have been a parasite the whole time. It says something about how easy it is to mistake proximity for friendliness in fossils, and frankly, in plenty of other contexts too. Nobody set out to be wrong about it, and I do not think there is anything careless about the original interpretation either. A snail sitting quietly by an exit, taking nothing that looked obviously stolen, truly does look harmless from a distance. It took drilling deeper in more ways than one, poring over statistics on stunted growth and cross-section shells under a microscope before the story finally cracked open into something more complicated and considerably less comfortable than anyone originally assumed. And here is the detail that convinces me the crinoids themselves eventually caught on. Look closely at certain crinoid species from later in this stretch of time, and you start noticing an odd little architectural addition, a long narrow tube extending upward from the usual location of the waist opening, sometimes stretching several times the height of the cup itself, like a chimney rising off the top of a house. Researchers now suspect that structure evolved specifically to keep these snails at arm's length, physically distancing the vulnerable opening from anything trying to settle in and drill its way toward the good stuff, and in populations of crinoids that never developed that particular chimney infestation, rates by these same snails run noticeably higher. Some species went further still, growing sharp defensive spines across the surface of the cup itself, a detail researchers have connected to the very same pressure, since the species carrying the most elaborate spines also tend to show up on the list of preferred targets most often. It is about as close as the fossil record ever gets to catching a defensive renovation. In progress, one species quietly redesigning its own home in direct response to an unwelcome tenant adding a chimney. Here, a fence of spines there, the underwater equivalent of finally installing a proper lock after years of leaving the door unlatched. Let me ask you something here actually, because I think it cuts right to the heart of what makes this kind of relationship so unsettling to sit with. Would you rather deal with an enemy who announces itself clearly, teeth-bared no question about its intentions, or one that moves in quietly looking for all the world like a harmless neighbour, and only reveals what it actually wanted from you years, or in this case eons later? My honest answer is that the quiet one frightens me more, and apparently if the chimneys and the spines are anything to go by, it frightened the crinoids too. Now snails were far from the only threat working its way through this crowded meadow, and honestly, some of what was hunting here left behind evidence considerably more direct than a single suspicious drill hole. Somewhere above the meadow, early sharks and armored-jawed fish were cruising the shallows, testing out an entirely new evolutionary toolkit built around biting rather than filtering, and a crinoid meadow, dense, slow-moving, and utterly unable to flee, made for an easy first course. Fragments of crinoid arms and stems have turned up preserved, inside fossilized fish droppings, a detail that sounds almost comically undignified when you say it out loud, but tells paleontologists exactly what it needs to. Something with jaws was actively biting into these animals, chewing through segments of arm and passing the leftovers straight through its digestive system, leaving the evidence scattered across the seafloor for something to stumble across 300 million years later. Which finally brings us to the promise I made earlier tonight and never quite got around to keeping. Because it turns out this animal did not simply sit there and absorb every bite that came its way. It fought back in the only way something with no claws, no teeth, and no ability to flee really could. When a predator managed to clamp down on one of these feathery arms, the crinoid did not necessarily lose the entire limb to the attack. At a specific predetermined point along the arm, almost like a built-in seam, sewn into the structure precisely for this purpose, the animal is able to deliberately release the damaged section, sacrificing the bitten portion entirely and sealing the wound instantly behind it. The same basic trick a lizard uses when it sheds its own tail, rather than lose its whole body to whatever just grabbed it. Scientists call this autotomy, and it turns a potentially fatal encounter into something closer to an inconvenience, a toll paid, rather than a death sentence delivered. The lost portion is not gone for good either. Slowly over the following weeks, a new arm regrows from the stump, rebuilding the lost feeding surface almost from scratch, cell by cell, until the missing piece has quietly filled itself back in. It is, if you think about it for more than a few seconds, a strange kind of courage, an animal that survives not by refusing to be hurt, but by getting remarkably good at recovering afterward. And here is where the story turns into something closer to a real detective case, one I find myself coming back to more than almost any other fact in this whole investigation. Researchers studying slabs of fossilized crinoids from across a long stretch of the Paleozoic noticed something curious once they started systematically counting these regrown arms stump by stump across hundreds of specimens, one slab after another, patiently tallying scars the way a historian might count bullet holes in an old battlefield wall. Early on, regenerating arms were relatively rare, showing up in only a small fraction of individuals, fewer than 1 in 20. But moving forward through the fossil record into a stretch of time when fish and other early predators were rapidly diversifying and getting noticeably better at hunting, that number climbed sharply, more than doubling within roughly the same slice of geological time, until well over 1 in 10 crinoids examined carried the telltale signature of a healed attack. It is essentially a scar count spread out across millions of years, and it tells a strikingly clear story. As the hunters improved, the hunted got better at surviving the encounter. An actual measurable arms race preserved not in weapons or armor, but in the simple, quiet act of healing. By the time we reach the crowded meadow we've been exploring tonight, this particular arrangement, bite, sacrifice, regrowth, was no longer a new trick. It was already an old, well-rehearsed survival strategy practiced for longer than most animal lineages managed to exist at all. I keep returning to that framing honestly because it pushes back against something we touched on earlier in this story, back when we talked about patience alone carrying this animal through catastrophe after catastrophe. Patience explains how you survive a crisis. Nobody is actively causing a cold snap, a shifting coastline, a slow squeeze of changing chemistry in the water. It does not explain how you survive something actively trying to eat you, piece by piece for tens of millions of years, running something with intent, so to speak, even if that intent is nothing more than simple hunger. That takes a different kind of resilience altogether, not the ability to avoid every wound, but the ability to absorb one again and again, and simply grow back stronger than the attack expected you to. Two very different survival stories really running side by side across the same impossibly long stretch of time, one built on asking very little of a chaotic world, the other built on recovering over and over from a world that occasionally reached out and took a bite. If you had to choose honestly between an animal built never to get hurt in the first place and one built to recover completely every single time it does, which one would you actually trust to still be standing several 100 million years from now? I think most of us, if we're being truthful, would probably bet on the armor. This particular story suggests otherwise. There is, as it happens, one particular stretch of ancient seafloor where almost everything we have talked about tonight, the swaying stalks, the crowded neighbours, the drilling snails, the bitten arms healed and regrown, got frozen into the rock together all at once, in a level of detail that still leaves professional paleontologists a little stunned when they first see it laid out in a drawer. It has a name and a story of its own, involving an entirely unremarkable afternoon, and a boy who had absolutely no idea what he had just picked up off the ground, no idea that his small discovery would eventually hand scientists the clearest window anyone has ever had into exactly how all of this, the height, the roommates, the predators, the healing actually fit together in one single crowded breathing community. And that story, I think, deserves to be told properly right from the very beginning. Every story eventually needs its proper beginning, the one you do not skip past, So let's go back all the way back to a stretch of muddy creek water in the middle of the United States in a year that has absolutely nothing to do with the Carboniferous at all. The year is 1842. A small college town in Indiana, the kind of place where everybody more or less knows everybody is settling into an ordinary autumn wagon wheels creaking down dirt roads, the college bell marking the hours the way it always did. And along the banks of a modest winding creek running through the edge of town, a 9-year-old boy is doing exactly what 9-year-old boys have always done near moving water, poking around, turning over rocks, looking for absolutely nothing in particular, and hoping to find something anyway, the way children have occupied themselves beside creeks, since long before anyone thought to write any of it down. His father happened to teach at the local college, and had a few years earlier already noticed something faintly odd scattered through the rock, along that same creek, small disc-shaped fragments, turning up again and again in the grey stone, curious little rings that nobody in town had bothered to explain. Nothing more than a passing observation filed away and mostly forgotten. Then his son came home carrying something considerably stranger than a disc. A small, lumpy, oddly rounded object worn smooth by the water that the boy, in the confident, matter-of-fact way only a 9-year-old can manage, announced he had found a petrified toad. I have to imagine there was at least a moment of genuine parental pride in that announcement, the specific satisfaction of a child bringing home proof of something magnificent. His father took one look at it, and realized almost immediately that his son had not found anything even remotely resembling an amphibian, petrified or otherwise. He was looking at the crown of a fossilized crinoid, the very same disc-shaped mystery he had already been quietly puzzling over, except this time attached to an entire unmistakable head. I love this story honestly more than I probably should, because it captures something true about how an enormous number of truly important discoveries actually happen. Nobody set out that morning looking for a doorway into the Carboniferous. A boy was simply bored and curious and willing to pick up something strange without immediately putting it back down. Have you ever found something as a kid half buried in a yard or a creek bed somewhere, and felt that same small flicker of certainty that you had stumbled onto something important, even if you had absolutely no idea what it actually was? I think almost everyone has a version of that memory tucked away somewhere. A rock, a bone, a strange piece of metal carried home in triumph and set proudly on a windowsill. Most of the time it really was just an interesting rock. This time it happened to be one of the most significant fossil discoveries the state of Indiana would ever produce. For nearly a decade after that first strange find, not much else happened. Word spread a little among the small circle of people who cared about such things, but no more crinoid heads turned up, and the discovery drifted into something closer to local curiosity than genuine scientific event. Then, in the early 1850s, students from that same small college stumbled onto 2 more complete specimens, and this time people started paying closer attention. A pair of local collectors began doing something nobody around here had really tried before, not simply waiting for the creek to wear new fossils loose on its own schedule, but actually digging directly into the bedrock itself, chasing the fossils rather than waiting for them to surface, naturally prying apart slabs of stone with nothing more than patience and a willingness to get their hands filthy for the sake of curiosity rather than profit. What they eventually pulled out of the ground turned this unassuming stretch of Indiana Creek bank into one of the single most important crinoid localities on the entire planet, a reputation that remarkably still holds today museum drawers on more than one continent, now carrying specimens that trace their entire history back to this single quiet corner of the American Midwest. Now, to understand exactly why this particular patch of ground turned out to matter so much, we need to circle back to something I mentioned earlier, and never quite finished explaining the reason most crinoid fossils in the world look nothing like the elegant, complete animal we have spent this whole story admiring. Here is the uncomfortable truth about dying underwater as a crinoid. The stalk, the cup, the delicate crown of feeding arms, all of it is held together not by rigid fused bone but by soft ligaments and tissue, binding one calcite plate to the next, thousands of individual pieces trusting an arrangement no sturdier than the connective tissue holding them in place. The moment the animal dies, that soft tissue begins breaking down almost immediately, sometimes within hours. Currents, scavengers, and simple decay scatter the individual plates apart before they ever get the chance to settle permanently into the rock as a single connected specimen, each disc drifting off on its own separate journey across the seafloor. Paleontologists actually have a blunt, unglamorous nickname for what this normally leaves behind. They call it crinoid hash, an appropriately unromantic term for what amounts to a jumbled scattering of individual discs and fragments. The crinoid equivalent of finding scattered puzzle pieces with absolutely no way to see what the finished picture ever looked like. Hundreds of pieces from hundreds of different puzzles all dumped into the same drawer together. What makes this particular patch of Indiana bedrock so extraordinary is that for one geologically brief and remarkably lucky stretch of time, that usual process of decay and scattering simply did not get the chance to happen. The seafloor here sat in shallow water close enough to a large river delta that every so often a storm or a sudden slump of loose sediment would come pouring down across the crinoid meadow, all at once burying entire communities alive and intact, before decomposition or scavengers had any opportunity to pull them apart. Instead of scattering into hash whole animals, sometimes dozens or hundreds of them at once were sealed directly into the rock, exactly as they stood in life, crown, open arms, extended stalk still connected all the way down to the base. It is less like finding a single preserved photograph, and more like stumbling onto an entire family portrait, every relative still standing exactly where they were caught the moment the shutter closed. And once researchers actually started properly excavating this material, the sheer scope of what had been preserved became almost difficult to believe. More than 60 separate species spread across more than 40 different genera, all pulled from roughly the same modest stretch of ancient seafloor, representing nearly every major branch of crinoid alive during this particular slice of the Carboniferous cladids and camerates and disparids and flexibles entire family lines that elsewhere in the world survive only as scattered unreadable fragments standing here complete, side by side in a single quarry outside a small Indiana town. Think back for a moment to that crowded, competitive neighborhood we spent so long exploring earlier tonight, all those different heights, all those different feeding strategies packed shoulder to shoulder into the same limited stretch of seafloor. This is the site that actually let scientists prove it, because so many specimens survived whole rather than scattered. Researchers could finally measure directly and with real confidence exactly how tall each individual species grew in life, confirming layer by careful layer that this ancient meadow really had organized itself into the stacked vertical structure we described earlier, rather than existing as some rough theoretical guess pieced together from scraps. Nearly half of the species pulled from this ground include at least one complete enough specimen to measure from base to crown, which is an almost absurd stroke of luck when you consider how rare a single whole crinoid usually is anywhere else on the planet. It answered another lingering question too, one we touched on just a little while ago. Tucked among these beautifully preserved crinoid crowns, researchers also found the remains of an ancient starfish, its arms still wrapped around the crinoid it had been feeding on. The moment the sediment came pouring down over both of them, caught in remarkably close association with its prey, direct physical confirmation from this exact patch of seafloor that these gentle-looking filter feeders really were being actively hunted by mobile predators crawling across the same crowded ground. Not an inference this time, not indirect evidence pieced together from statistics and scar counts, but an actual predator frozen mid-encounter in the same rock as its target, a single frozen instant of violence preserved alongside centuries of peaceful cohabitation. I keep coming back to the sheer improbability of all of it, honestly. A boy wanders along a creek bored on an ordinary afternoon, picks up something strange purely on a whim, and that small, unremarkable decision eventually unravels into confirmation of an entire ecological theory about a world that vanished hundreds of millions of years before anyone existed to witness it. There is something almost dizzying about that chain of cause and effect if you actually sit with it for a moment. A child's curiosity, a father who happened to recognize something unusual, because he had already been quietly paying attention to strange rocks for years. Beforehand, a pair of patient local collectors, willing to dig rather than simply wait, and an accident of geology so specific it may have only happened this cleanly in a small handful of places on the entire planet. Remove any single link in that chain the boy walks past without stopping. The father dismisses the object without a second look. The collectors never bother picking up a shovel, and this particular window into the deep past might never have opened at all. We would still be guessing at the shape of this ancient meadow instead of measuring it. Let me ask you something, actually, because I am curious whether this changes how you think about the ground beneath your own feet, wherever you happen to be tonight. If an ordinary creek bank in the middle of Indiana turned out to be hiding one of the best preserved ancient sea gardens on the planet, what do you suppose is sitting quietly underneath the place you grew up waiting for somebody curious enough and patient enough to actually go looking? Maybe nothing. Maybe something extraordinary resting a few feet down, entirely unremarkable on the surface, exactly the way this stretch of Indiana Creek bed must have looked, to absolutely everyone who walked past it for thousands of years before one bored 9-year-old finally decided to stop and look closer. There is one detail from all of this that I find myself circling back to more than almost anything else in this whole story. The sheer material fact of what all of this actually is now sitting in drawers, museum cases, and quite literally the bedrock of an entire region. What we are looking at is not simply a fossil in the ordinary sense of the word. It is stone that used to be a live mineral, that used to move, feed, and grow, and the exact chemical process that manages that particular transformation, turning a soft-breathing animal into solid rock, capable of surviving unchanged for hundreds of millions of years, sitting quietly under a creek bank until a 9-year-old boy happens to trip over it, is a story all its own, one considerably stranger than most people ever stop to consider. Here is a word most people never think to question, even though we use it constantly without really examining what it is actually claiming. Fossilization. We tend to picture some slow, mysterious alchemy, wood turning to stone atom by atom, over millions of patient years, an original shape slowly replaced by mineral, until nothing of the real animal remains, except its silhouette pressed into rock. That picture is not wrong exactly, and it does describe plenty of fossils perfectly well. It is just not what happened here, and the actual explanation, once you sit with it, is stranger and considerably more direct than almost anyone expects walking in. Because a crinoid skeleton was never really borrowed material waiting to be swapped out for stone. It was built from stone to begin with. Every plate, every disc, every fragment of that calcite structure we spent so long examining earlier tonight was already in its living form the exact same mineral you would find in a piece of limestone on a quarry wall. There was no substitution required, no slow atom by atom. Replacement stretched across geological time. The animal simply had to die, fall apart, and wait. Now remember what we established a little while ago, that catastrophic burial preserving an entire intact community, whole animals frozen mid-gesture, crown, open arms extended is the rare exception, rather than the rule, a stroke of geological luck rare enough to make international headlines among paleontologists whenever it turns up. For every crinoid lucky enough to be sealed away whole by a sudden slump of sediment, countless others met a far more ordinary fate, decomposing normally, their soft tissue giving way within days, scattering their calcite plates loose across the seafloor one disc at a time. No dramatic burial, no perfect preservation, just quiet, unremarkable decay. And here is where the story stops being about individual bad luck or good luck, and starts being about simple, staggering accumulation. Picture this shallow, warm sea stretching on generation after generation, crinoid after crinoid, each one eventually contributing its own small handful of calcite fragments to the floor beneath it. A single animal's remains barely register as anything at all, a light scattering of pale discs settling into the mud, easy to miss, easy to dismiss as nothing more than debris. But multiply that scattering across millions of individual lives spread out over a stretch of time, longer than any of us can truly picture, and something remarkable starts to happen. The seafloor itself, layer by imperceptible layer, stops being ordinary mud and starts being something closer to bone meal, an endless, gently accumulating snowfall of skeletal fragments settling and resettling with every passing season, thickening the way dust thickens on a shelf. Nobody bothers to clean for 500 million years, quietly building towards something none of the individual contributors could have possibly imagined. I want you to sit with that image for a second, honestly, because I think it is one of the strangest, quietly beautiful facts in this entire story. On an ordinary beach, sand is mostly just broken rock, tiny fragments of mountains worn down by wind and water over time, mineral that was never alive to begin with, never had a mouth, never once reached for anything. Here the sand itself used to be an animal. Every grain settling onto that ancient seafloor had only recently, in geological terms, been part of something reaching its arms into the current, filtering its own dinner, out of the passing water, sensing in its own limited way the difference between food and empty water. This was not simply sediment collecting on the seafloor. It was, in the most literal sense available, an entire community slowly becoming the ground it once stood on generation, quietly settling on top of generation, the living floor of one century becoming the foundation for the next. But a loose pile of skeletal debris, however thick, is not yet stone. Something else has to happen to lock all of that scattered material into something solid enough to survive for hundreds of millions of years, solid enough to still be sitting under our feet today. That process has a name: diagenesis. And honestly, it might be my favourite piece of chemistry in this whole story, because of how strangely fitting it turns out to be. It does not happen quickly by any measure a human life could ever apply to the word. We're talking about a transformation that unfolds across thousands, sometimes millions of years, so slow that no single generation of anything, crinoid or otherwise, could have ever witnessed it as movement. It would be a little like watching a single snowflake fall and expecting to see the glacier it eventually becomes, as layer after layer of these calcite fragments piled up the weight of everything settling on top, gradually pressed the older material down and together, squeezing water out from between the loose grains the way a sponge gives up its water under a firm hand. And that same mineral-rich water, working its way slowly through the tiny gaps left behind, began doing something remarkable. It started depositing new calcite crystals directly into those gaps, growing fresh mineral in the empty spaces between one fragment and the next, gradually welding the whole scattered pile into a single continuous mass, crystal by microscopic crystal, over a span of time too slow for any single lifetime to ever register as movement at all. Geologists have a specific word for this new connective mineral sparret, and here is the detail I find almost too poetic to be a coincidence. The cement holding this entire structure together is built from the exact same substance as the fragments it is cementing. It is not a foreign glue forcing unrelated material into a shape it never wanted. It is calcite reuniting with calcite, an animal's own mineral chemistry, quietly finishing the job its body started, welding a scattered community back together into a single unbroken slab of rock family, reuniting with family long after every individual member had already died and gone their separate ways. Let me ask you something here actually, because I am curious how this lands for you. Does it feel stranger to imagine an animal's body slowly replaced by foreign stone over millions of years, the classic version of fossilization most of us grew up picturing, or to imagine an animal that was already made of stone simply falling apart and welding itself back together on a scale too large and too slow for anyone to have ever actually witnessed happening? I go back and forth on it myself, honestly, some nights leaning one way, some nights the other, which is probably a sign that both versions deserve exactly the amount of wonder we usually only give to one of them. And once you start looking at the actual scale involved, the whole picture gets even harder to hold in your head all at once. In parts of the American Midwest stretching across what is now Iowa and neighboring stretches of Missouri, geologists have mapped limestone formations built from exactly this process, layer upon layer of crinoid fragments, cemented solid running for hundreds of feet in thickness, and stretching across an area you could not walk across in a single day. Quarry workers digging into these formations centuries later would eventually give the resulting stone its own working name, Crinoid, a technical term for limestone built almost entirely out of these ancient echinoderm fragments, so consistently packed with crinoid debris that entire hillsides in the region are quite literally more crinoid than mud. Think about what that actually requires. Not simply a great many individual animals dying over the course of this ancient sea's existence, but something closer to an uncountable, almost incomprehensible number generation folding into generation, each contributing its own small forgotten handful of fragments to a structure none of them could have possibly known they were building. Nobody designed this. Nobody organized it. It happened purely because an entire ecosystem kept living and dying and settling in the same general patch of ocean for long enough that simple accumulation eventually became architecture. I keep thinking about the sheer, almost absurd disproportion of it, honestly. An animal small enough to sit comfortably in the palm of your hand, working alongside countless billions of relatives it never met, none of them intending anything at all beyond simply surviving one more day, and the accidental result stacked up and cemented together over unthinkable spans of time is bedrock solid enough to build an entire region on top of. Not one of these creatures ever set out to build a monument. If you had somehow asked a single crinoid mid-meal whether it had any long-term architectural ambitions, I suspect the honest answer, if it could somehow answer at all, would have been a flat no, followed by a return to filtering the water for whatever drifted by next. And yet here it still is hundreds of millions of years later, holding up roads and rivers and towns that have absolutely no idea what they're actually standing on. There is something almost humbling about that kind of unintentional monument built by creatures with no concept of permanence, no ambition beyond the next meal drifting past in the current. Which raises a question worth carrying with you the next time you happen to be walking across a stretch of pale grey stone anywhere in the world. A sidewalk, a quarry wall, the foundation of an old building nobody thinks twice about. How much of what we casually call solid ground, the very thing we build our entire lives on top of without a second thought, actually began its existence as something quietly alive, reaching its arms into a warm current 300 million years before any of us showed up to walk across the result? Have you ever picked up a plain, unremarkable grey rock, the kind most people would walk straight past without a glance, and actually stop to wonder what it used to be back before it was simply a rock? I do it constantly now, and I will be honest, it has slowed down more than one perfectly ordinary walk, because here is where this particular story takes its strangest turn, yet at least to my mind. Long after this ancient seafloor had fully hardened into ordinary-looking rock, long after the animals themselves had been forgotten, entirely buried under an equally ancient blanket of soil and time, human hands eventually started cutting into that same stone for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with crinoids and absolutely everything to do with what people can accidentally stumble into once they start prying rock out of the ground for their very different purposes. They were not looking for fossils, they were looking for building material, something solid enough to raise a wall sturdy enough to lay a floor, and what they found, without initially understanding what they were actually holding, was stone quietly packed from edge to edge with the compressed remains of an entire vanished garden. Some of those quarried blocks, cut and polished and never once suspected of hiding anything unusual, would eventually travel a very long way from the quiet seafloor where they were born, ending up in places nobody digging them out of the ground could have possibly predicted, places built for prayer, for memory, for exactly the kind of permanence this ancient garden never once set out to achieve and somehow achieved anyway. Places built for prayer, I said a moment ago, and I want to start there properly, because before this stone ever ended up cut into walls and floors, it had already found its way into people's hands in a far stranger, far more personal way, centuries before anyone thought to quarry it on purpose. Off the northeastern coast of England sits a small windswept island called Lindisfarne, often called the Holy Island by the people who live nearby, cut off from the mainland twice a day when the tide comes in, and reachable on foot the rest of the time across a stretch of wet sand that has swallowed more than one careless traveller over the centuries. For well over 1,000 years this island has been associated with a monk named Cuthbert, who lived there in the 7th century and eventually became its bishop, a gentle, deeply respected figure in early English Christianity, remembered long after his death for his humility as much as his devotion, the kind of quiet reputation that tends to outlast far louder legacies. And along the beach below the old priory for centuries, local people kept finding small disc-shaped stones, pale, ringed with a tiny hole bored straight through the centre of each one as though someone had drilled them on purpose. Enough of these little stones washed up generation after generation that an entire local tradition grew up around them. People started calling them St. Cuthbert's beads, and the story attached to that name is one of my favourite pieces of folklore in this entire investigation, precisely because of how tenderly, how earnestly people held on to it. According to the legend, Cuthbert himself was responsible for the beads, either as the maker of them or as their original owner, depending on which version of the story you happen to grow up hearing. Some versions held that his spirit still visited the shore on stormy nights, sitting on one rock and using another as an anvil, quietly forging each bead in the dark, the sound of his hammering carrying faintly over the wind, so that faithful hands could gather the finished beads from the sand the following morning, evidence that he had not forgotten the island even in death. Other versions were gentler still, suggesting the beads were simply his own strung together into a rosary he had carried and prayed with during his lifetime, lost to the sea centuries ago, and still somehow washing back to shore for anyone patient enough to go looking. I find something truly moving about that image, honestly, a community gathering small mysterious stones off a beach for generation after generation. And rather than simply shrugging at the mystery, choosing instead to wrap it in devotion, connecting it to someone they already loved and respected. It says something rather lovely about how people tend to handle the things they cannot explain. Given a genuine mystery, we do not always reach for indifference. Sometimes we reach for reverence instead, filling the gap left by not knowing with meaning rather than simply leaving it empty. I'm not sure that instinct has changed very much even now, even with all the science we've gathered since. There is, however, a small wrinkle in the story, one that the earliest written record of this legend from the late 1600s does not appear to have worried about very much. Rosaries as an actual devotional object strung on a cord did not really exist anywhere in Britain until many centuries after Cuthbert had already died. Which means, strictly speaking, the version of the legend involving his own personal rosary could not possibly be historically accurate, no matter how sincerely it was believed. And yet the story persisted anyway, quietly passed from one generation of islanders to the next, corrected by nobody, because the truth of it was never really about verifiable history in the first place. It was about connection, about wanting a small strange gift from the sea to mean something more than geology. Here is where I get to hand you the actual answer, the one nobody on that beach had access to for well over 1,000 years. Those small ringed hole-punch stones are not carved. Nobody forged them, mortal or otherwise. They are crinoid columnals, the very same stacked discs we spent time examining earlier tonight. The individual segments of a stalk once belonging to an animal that filtered the current for its dinner 300 million years before anyone on that island had ever heard the word Christianity, let alone practiced it. What generations of faithful islanders were gathering off that beach believing they held something touched by a saint was in the most literal sense a piece of the very garden we have spent this entire evening exploring, worn loose by the tide and washed up onto a completely unrelated shoreline of human meaning. Let me ask you something actually, because I think this touches on something worth sitting with honestly. Does it feel like it takes something away from the story learning where those beads actually came from? Or does it, if anything, make the whole tradition a little more remarkable? An entire community building genuine devotion generation after generation around a fragment of the deep past they had no scientific way of understanding. I lean toward the second reading myself, though I understand entirely if you land somewhere else. There is a particular kind of faith involved in loving something correctly for the wrong reasons, and I am not sure that faith deserves to be mocked just because the science eventually caught up with it. And this particular pattern, it turns out, was never confined to one small island. Elsewhere across the English countryside, people gave these same little discs entirely different names, depending on where they happened to wash up or turn up in a ploughed field, calling them fairy money in some regions, imagining tiny woodland spirits scattering coins across the land rather than a bishop forging beads by lamplight or starstones. In others, a nod to the small five-pointed pattern often visible in cross-section. And across the ocean, settlers in parts of the United States encountering the exact same objects scattered through creek beds and quarry walls coined their own name entirely, calling them Indian beads, assuming reasonably enough given the shape that they had been strung and worked by earlier human hands, an entirely separate culture, reaching independently for the exact same kind of explanation. Different continents, different centuries, different mythologies entirely, and yet the same small stone kept prompting the exact same instinct in every culture that stumbled across it, the conviction that something this deliberately shaped could not possibly be an accident of nature. It had to have been made by somebody. I think that says something rather touching about us, honestly. This repeated independent refusal to believe that geometry this precise could simply happen on its own, without a maker somewhere behind it. Now, folklore was never the only way this material ended up in human hands. Long after quarrymen understood exactly what they were cutting into this same crinoid, rich limestone kept getting pulled directly out of English hillsides for entirely practical reasons, valued not for any mystery attached to it, but simply for how well it worked as a building material, and once polished for how remarkably beautiful it turned out to be. Quarrymen in Derbyshire cutting into a particular pale limestone thick with these same fossil fragments gave their local stone a working nickname of its own, calling it bird's eye marble on account of the small circular crinoid fragments studding the surface, catching the light like 100 tiny watchful pupils staring out of the polished rock. In the north of England, a dark crinoid-streaked stone quarried around Nidderdale found its way into the stonework of Fountains Abbey, one of the great medieval monastic ruins of Yorkshire, its columns and floors quietly built from the compressed remains of the same kind of underwater meadow we opened this story standing in. Not far away in the chapter house of Jervul, Abbey, columns cut from a similarly fossil-laden stone still stand today, worshippers for centuries walking past pillars built quite literally from an ancient sea garden without the faintest idea what they were looking at. But there is one particular use of this stone that I find harder to sit with than any of the others in the best possible way. In the aftermath of both world wars, when countless communities across Europe and beyond needed something solid and dignified to mark the graves and memorials of the dead, a pale crinoid, rich limestone quarried from Derbyshire, was chosen again and again for exactly that purpose, carved into simple crosses that still stand today across cemeteries scattered from Britain to North Africa, rows upon rows of them, identical in shape, each one marking a single irreplaceable life. Whoever selected that particular stone almost certainly never gave a single thought to what it was actually made of. They were choosing it for its colour, its durability, its quiet dignity, under an open sky, through every kind of weather, not for any awareness of the small circular fossils pressed invisibly into its surface. Which means that somewhere right now, a family visiting a war memorial to grieve someone they lost is very possibly standing in front of a stone built from the same patient filter-feeding animal. We've spent this entire evening getting to know 300 million years of quiet, unremarkable survival, eventually pressed into service, marking the most painful kind of human loss imaginable. I do not think there is anything small about that connection, honestly. An animal that asked almost nothing of the world, that survived catastrophe after catastrophe, through nothing more dramatic than patience and the willingness to heal, ended up becoming the material human beings reached for when they needed to mark their own deepest grief. It never intended any of that, obviously. It could not have. And yet there it still is, standing quietly in cemetery after cemetery, doing in its own way exactly what it always did best, holding something up without asking anything in return. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other ordinary-looking stones scattered through the churches and cemeteries and old buildings near you are secretly carrying the exact same kind of forgotten history, waiting for somebody to actually stop and look closely enough to notice. The next time you happen to pass a stone wall, a church floor, a quiet row of memorial crosses, it might be worth a second glance just in case. But for all the reverence this ancient garden eventually earned purely by accident, centuries after its own extinction, none of that stone permanence tells us anything about what was actually happening to the living animal itself, back when it still had arms to reach with and a current to feed from. Because for all its patience, for all its resilience, this empire was not going to last forever either. Somewhere in the long, slow arc of its own history, quietly and then not so quietly it began coming apart, and the story of exactly how that happened deserves to be told with the same care we have given everything else tonight. Here is something I did not expect to find when I started digging into how this story actually ends, and I suspect it might surprise you too. The decline did not begin at the edge of some dramatic catastrophe arriving all at once to end a golden age in a single afternoon, the way these stories so often get told in the version that ends up on a documentary poster. It began quietly from the inside, while the garden was still by almost every visible measure at the absolute height of its power, thriving in plain sight, even as something underneath it had already begun very slowly to give way. Somewhere in the middle stretch of the very period we have spent this entire evening exploring, before the meadow had even finished expanding into the crowded, tiered, endlessly varied community we walked through. Earlier tonight, the overall diversity of crinoid life had already begun a slow, almost imperceptible slide. Fewer new species appearing, certain older lineages quietly failing to replace themselves. Nothing dramatic enough to notice if you were actually standing there, swaying gently in the current alongside everyone else, filtering the same water your parents and grandparents had filtered for longer than anyone could remember. And for a long time, paleontologists honestly could not agree on what that slide even meant. Here is the honest complication, one that I think says something important about how difficult it actually is to read a story this old. When researchers noticed this dip in diversity, the first question anyone had to ask was uncomfortable but necessary. Is this a real biological event, an actual decline in living animals, or is it simply an illusion created by imperfect preservation, a gap in the fossil record rather than a gap in the actual population? Rock from this particular stretch of time is in places frustratingly incomplete, and it is entirely possible to mistake missing evidence for a missing population. For years that question sat unresolved, a genuine mystery, rather than a settled fact. Exactly the kind of uncertainty I find myself oddly fond of by this point in the story. More recent research has started leaning toward an answer, and if it holds up, it points towards something almost eerie in how it echoes a conversation we already had earlier tonight, back when we were admiring how much oxygen filled this world, how it let certain creatures grow to sizes that still sound made up centuries later. It turns out oxygen may have played a role here too, except working in the opposite direction, the same variable that once inflated dragonflies to the size of hawks, now possibly working quietly against the very animals living underneath the surface of that oxygen-rich air. Evidence buried in the chemistry of rocks from this stretch of time suggests atmospheric oxygen may have dipped noticeably during exactly this window, and a drop like that would have rippled straight down into the shallow seas. This entire garden depended on thinning out the very water these animals needed to breathe and feed in, tightening conditions across an ecosystem that had spent tens of millions of years assuming abundance was simply the natural order of things. Nothing sudden, nothing violent, just a slow, chemical tightening of the conditions that had allowed this particular kind of abundance to exist in the first place. I find something almost unsettling about that image, honestly. An empire beginning to hollow out quietly from within its own residence, likely never noticing anything was wrong, still reaching their arms into the current every single day, still filtering, still surviving, still raising the next generation into what looked from the inside like exactly the same abundant world their parents had known, completely unaware that the ground beneath their entire way of life had already started shifting. There is something almost tender about that blindness. If I am honest, the same blindness any of us would probably share standing in the middle of our own particular moment in history, with no real way of knowing which of our own quiet, comfortable certainties are already starting invisibly to come apart. Let me ask you something here, actually, because I think it cuts close to something worth sitting with. Do you think decline usually announces itself, or do you think it tends to arrive quietly, first disguised as nothing more than a slightly worse year than the one before it, indistinguishable from ordinary bad luck, until enough of those years have piled up to finally be undeniable? By the time the Carboniferous world was drawing toward its final stretch, that slow undercurrent of decline had company. Down at the bottom of the planet, ice was beginning to accumulate across an enormous stretch of the southern supercontinent, glaciers spreading and thickening in a way the world had not seen for a very long time, entire mountain ranges of ice building up in a hemisphere. The Crinoids sprawling across their warm tropical seas would never have imagined could exist. And glaciers, it turns out, do not stay politely confined to one hemisphere and mind their own business. Locking up that much water in ice caused sea levels across the entire globe to rise and fall again and again in a long uneven rhythm, repeatedly flooding and then draining the exact kind of shallow, sunlit coastal seas this garden had spent 200 million years learning to call home. Imagine trying to run a business in a storefront that periodically, unpredictably, either floods completely or has its water shut off entirely over and over for millions of years running, and you start to get a feel for what these repeated swings in sea level were actually doing to a community built entirely around one very specific, very narrow set of conditions. A shallow shelf of warm water that could no longer be relied upon to simply stay put. The world these animals had built their entire existence around was no longer holding still, long enough for that existence to feel guaranteed. And then tens of millions of years after the Carboniferous itself had already ended, long after this particular meadow we've spent an entire evening exploring had already faded into something smaller and quieter than its former self, the planet delivered a blow so severe that scientists studying it today still refer to it with a kind of grim informality, simply as the great dying a name that manages to be both entirely unscientific and completely devastatingly accurate, which is more than I can say for most of the technical terminology we have waded through tonight. Massive volcanic activity on the other side of the globe, an eruption unlike almost anything the planet has produced before or since, poured staggering quantities of gas into the atmosphere over a relatively short stretch of geological time, disrupting the climate, souring the chemistry of the oceans, and stripping away oxygen from vast stretches of seawater all at once, turning entire regions of what had once been rich living ocean into something closer to a chemical dead zone. When the dust and the ash and the poisoned water finally settled somewhere in the range of 9 out of every 10 marine species alive on the planet were simply gone, it remains to this day the single worst extinction event in the entire recorded history of life on Earth, dwarfing even the far more famous event that would later end the age of dinosaurs, an event most of us learned about in school, while this considerably larger one barely earns a passing mention. Crinoids did not escape that reckoning either. The overwhelming majority of the lineages that had spent the Carboniferous filling every available tier of that crowded competitive meadow simply vanished in the aftermath. Entire branches of that sprawling family tree we traced all the way back to a rough little sketch buried in a Cambrian mudslide gone within what amounts to a geological blink. Here is a number worth sitting with for a moment, because I think it puts the true scale of everything we have spent tonight exploring into a kind of perspective that is honestly a little humbling. Across the whole of the ancient world we've been describing, researchers estimate that somewhere between 5 and 10 times more crinoid species once existed than survive across the entire planet today. Not slightly more. Not a modest decline, an empire that at its absolute peak may have hosted somewhere close to 10 separate species, for every single one that remains an entire library of designs, heights, feeding strategies and family lines, reduced over the course of hundreds of millions of years down to a single surviving shelf. I keep turning that number over honestly because it resists the tidy, comforting shape we usually want survival stories to take. This was not a story about one plucky lineage narrowly escaping extinction through cleverness or luck, the kind of ending that would look good on a poster. This was a story about staggering near total loss and empire that ruled the seafloor for longer than almost anything else, in the fossil record reduced by the time all the dust settled to a modest fraction of its former self. Patience got this animal through catastrophe after catastrophe earlier in its history. Regeneration got individual animals through individual attacks, bite after bite, arm after arm. But neither patience nor regeneration, it turns out, is quite enough to fully outrun a planet actively rewriting the chemistry of its own oceans all at once. There is a lesson in that, I think, though it is not a particularly comfortable one, and I do not think it deserves to be softened just to make the ending feel nicer. No matter how successful a way of living becomes, no matter how many catastrophes it has already survived, no matter how many hundreds of millions of years it has already outlasted, permanence is never actually guaranteed. Dominance, this vast, this patient, this well-earned, still turned out to be borrowed rather than owned outright. I think most of us on some level quietly assume that whatever feels permanent in our own lives, a career, a landscape, a way things have simply always been, will keep being permanent simply because it always has been so far. This particular story suggests that assumption has never actually been safe, not even for something that ruled the ocean floor. For a length of time, our entire species has not yet come close to matching. And yet here is the detail I've been holding on to quietly since the very beginning of this story, because it deserves to close things out rather than open them. Somewhere between 5 and 10 times fewer species, yes, an empire reduced almost beyond recognition, but not to zero, not quite. Because against every reasonable expectation, against nearly every catastrophe this planet has thrown at it, since that first rough little sketch buried itself in Cambrian mud, this animal in a much smaller, much quieter form is still out there tonight somewhere in the deep, dark water most of us will never actually see. Let me ask you something honestly before we go looking for it together. Knowing everything we now know, the oxygen, the ice, the great dying, the almost unthinkable scale of what was lost, does the fact that anything at all survived feel like a small miracle to you? Or does it simply feel like exactly what you would expect from something patient enough to have already outlasted 500 million years of everything else the planet could throw at it? I think it is somewhere between the two, if I am honest with you, which is probably the most truthful answer this particular story has to offer. Comfort and unease sitting right next to each other, the way they usually do, whenever something this old and this patient turns out to still be quietly going about its business without asking anyone's permission. Let's go find out together all the way down past the point most of us will ever actually travel in our own lifetimes. In the long uncertain stretch of time following the Great Dying, the handful of crinoid lineages that managed to survive did not simply pick up exactly where their ancestors had left off. Something about the world itself had changed too permanently for that. New predators were emerging across these recovering oceans, sharper, toothed, faster, moving considerably less patient than anything the meadow had faced during its earlier golden age, and a body plan built entirely around standing still in one spot. However elegant, however successful it had once been, started to look less like a strength and more like a liability. So a strange thing happened slowly across the following tens of millions of years. Some of the surviving lineages simply let go of the one feature that had defined this entire story from the very first minute we spent together tonight. They abandoned the stalk. Picture that for a moment, because I think it deserves a moment of real attention. The long jointed column we examined so closely earlier, the very structure that gave this animal its name, its silhouette, its whole identity as something rooted, patient, permanent, quietly became optional. In many of these newer lineages, a young animal still grows a small stalk early in its life, a brief temporary anchor while it develops, but eventually detaches from it entirely, drifting free, crawling and even swimming across the sea floor for the rest of its life, using nothing but its own crown of feathered arms, flexing them in slow, rippling waves, the way a bird might beat its wings underwater. Today, scientists call these unstalked descendants feather stars, and if you ever happen to see underwater footage of one gently flexing its arms to glide a short distance across a reef or curling itself tightly closed the moment a shadow passes overhead, you are watching a direct descendant of the exact same body plan. We open this entire story admiring just considerably more willing to run when trouble shows up. The very same animal that once staked its entire survival strategy on staying rooted to one spot had by this point learned an entirely new lesson from an entirely new world, that sometimes staying put is no longer the wisest option available. Not every surviving lineage made that particular trade, though. A smaller handful kept the ancient design mostly intact. The stalk, the hold-fast, the whole patient architecture we spent an entire evening exploring. But even they did not simply carry on as though nothing had happened. As the ages passed and predators kept getting better and better at cracking open anything slow and stationary, jaws and claws growing sharper with each new generation of hunter, these remaining stalked crinoids found themselves increasingly pushed toward one particular refuge, retreating generation after generation into water deep enough and dark enough that the newer, sharper-toothed hunters mostly could not be bothered to follow. The shallow, sunlit meadows we spent this whole story exploring simply stopped being safe for anything built this way. The deep ocean, cold, dark, and comparatively undisturbed, became the last place on the planet still willing to let an animal like this stand still and wait. A quiet retreat rather than a defeat, the kind of slow, patient withdrawal that rarely makes it into the more dramatic tellings of natural history. Here is where the story takes one final remarkable turn, and honestly it might be my favourite chapter in this entire investigation. For a very long stretch of scientific history, these deep water-stalked crinoids were known to researchers purely as fossils, elegant shapes pressed into ancient rock, assumed quite reasonably to have vanished from the living world entirely. Millions of years ago, a chapter closed a design, retired a curiosity for museum cabinets rather than tide pools. Then, in the 1870s, a British scientific expedition set sail aboard a converted warship called the Challenger, on what would become one of the most important ocean survey voyages in the history of science, dragging dredges and nets across the sea floor at depths nobody had ever seriously sampled, before hauling equipment up from water so deep and so cold that the crew had very little idea what, if anything, they might actually find waiting down there. And somewhere in that dark, crushing water hauled up onto the deck along with mud and rock and countless unfamiliar creatures were animals that should not have been there at all, at least according to everything scientists thought they knew. Living stalked crinoids virtually identical in shape to fossils that had until that exact moment only ever been found in solid stone. I try to imagine what that moment must have actually felt like standing on the deck of that ship, cold salt spray in the air, hauling up a net full of mud and darkness, and finding tangled somewhere inside it something that by every reasonable expectation belonged only to the deep past, and finding it instead still warm, still moving, still alive. It is the kind of discovery that earns a phrase we throw around a little too casually most of the time, living fossil, except in this case the phrase is not an exaggeration. It is simply plainly accurate, a genuine bridge reaching directly from a stone drawer in a museum to a living, breathing animal still doing exactly what its ancestors did, unaware that anyone had ever assumed it was gone. Let me ask you something, actually, before we bring this particular story home. Somewhere right now in water so deep that sunlight has never once reached it, a handful of these creatures are quietly reaching their arms into a current that has been running in one form or another for over 500 million years. Does it comfort you to know that, or does it unsettle you a little? The idea of something still swaying down there, patient and unbothered, completely indifferent to everything that has happened on the surface of this planet in the meantime. So let's go back one final time to the image we opened with all those hours ago now. A vast, crowded meadow stretching for miles across a warm, shallow sea, thousands upon thousands of feathery crowns swaying together in the current, dense enough to slow the water itself, dense enough to shelter entire communities of smaller creatures tucked among the stalks, a whole civilization of quiet, patient animals that never once knew they were building anything at all. That world in the form we described it is gone, and has been gone for longer than human beings have existed to miss it. What remains is scattered, solitary, tucked into the coldest, darkest corners of the ocean, far from where any of us will ever casually stumble across it on a summer afternoon at the beach. And yet it is not nothing. A few ghosts of that ancient garden are still out there tonight, still swaying, still filtering, still doing patiently and without complaint the one thing this entire family of animals has always done best, holding on quietly, long after almost everything else from their original world has turned to stone or coal or memory. Somewhere in the black water off a coastline you have probably never visited a single stalked crinoid is at this exact moment opening its crown into a current. Nobody is watching the way its ancestors did for hundreds of millions of years before a single human being existed to notice, and the way its descendants will likely keep doing long after every one of us listening tonight is gone too. I think that is where this particular story actually wants to end, not with a triumphant return, and not with a clean, tidy extinction either, but somewhere in between, the way most true stories about survival actually tend to land. An empire that once covered entire coastlines, reduced to scattered survivors in the dark. A body plan so successful it accidentally became the bedrock of entire regions, the beads on a saint's rosary, the stone in a war memorial, the floor of a monastery nobody visiting ever thinks twice about. And underneath all of it, the same quiet lesson. This whole investigation kept circling back to night after night, chapter after chapter, whether we were talking about an arm sacrificed the way a lizard sheds its own tail, a snail with questionable intentions, or an entire ecosystem quietly hollowing out from the inside without anyone noticing. Patience outlasts catastrophe far more often than force does. Recovery matters more than invincibility. Convergent solutions keep showing up in the strangest, most unrelated corners of the tree of life, as though certain answers were simply waiting to be discovered by whoever got there first, and nothing, no matter how ancient, no matter how dominant, no matter how deeply it feels woven into the permanent fabric of the world, is ever actually guaranteed to stay exactly as it is. If there is one single image I hope you carry out of this evening with you past tonight into whatever comes next, let it be this one. Somewhere beneath your own feet or beneath the feet of someone you love, there is very likely a piece of an ancient forgotten garden pressed into rock, waiting patiently for someone curious enough to actually notice it. You do not need a research vessel or a dredge net to find that kind of wonder. Sometimes it is simply a matter of slowing down enough to look at the ground. Thank you honestly for spending this entire evening with me down in that warm ancient sea and back out again all the way to a beach in England and a creek in Indiana, and a deep, dark trench most of us will never see with our own eyes. Stories like this one only really work with someone patient enough to sit through all of it. Someone willing to slow down, dim the lights, and actually listen, rather than simply scroll past, and I am grateful more than a quick sentence like this can really capture that you were that person tonight. If something in tonight's journey stayed with you a detail you did not expect, a small ache you were not prepared for, or maybe just the strange comfort of knowing something, this old is still quietly out there, doing its own thing in the dark. Hold on to it. Let it follow you into sleep tonight the way the best of these stories are supposed to. There is another story waiting somewhere out there in the dark, just as strange and just as real as this one, full of its own quiet patience, its own small miracles, its own forgotten corners of history waiting to be noticed. And when it is ready, I would love nothing more than to have you here again, lights low world, quiet, ready to go looking for it together. Until then, rest easy, sleep well.